Utah looks quiet at first glance. Red cliffs, dry valleys, and long stretches of open desert. But hidden in these places are mysteries left behind by ancient people, ancient animals, and forces that shaped the land long before anyone lived here. Rock art no one can fully read, footprints frozen in mud, lost villages, stone spheres, and clues to worlds older than memory. Each chapter shows something real that science has studied for years but still cannot fully explain. Ghosts in the Sandstone, the Great Gallery, Horseshoe Canyon. The first sound to reach you in Horseshoe Canyon is the echo of your own footsteps. The canyon walls rise in steep, pale cliffs on both sides, and the air feels still in a way that seems older than anything you know. As you move deeper into this remote arm of the desert, the trail curves, the light softens, and then, almost without warning, the wall appears. It stretches across the sandstone like a silent arrival from another time. This is the Great Gallery, one of the most enigmatic displays of ancient rock art anywhere on the continent. From a distance, the figures look like faint shadows pressed onto the stone, but as you come closer, the shapes become clearer. Dozens of tall, narrow forms stand in rows, some over 2 meters tall. Their bodies taper like long silhouettes, their heads round or helmet-shaped, their eyes wide and empty. Some seem to float. Others hold shapes that resemble plants or snakes. A few are surrounded by smaller figures, animals, birds, crescents, lines. The sandstone has protected them for thousands of years, and despite fading pigments and desert varnish creeping at the edges, the scene still feels strangely alive. The canyon itself adds to the sensation. It is quiet here, so quiet that even a distant gust seems amplified. The alcove that shelters the panel traps a faint echo, as if the place was shaped deliberately for ceremony or meaning. There is no quick answer for who painted these images or why this wall in particular became their canvas. The people who walked here left no written record and no story explaining these towering shapes. Only this panel, stretched more than 200 feet across, filled with the presence of beings we do not fully understand. Archaeologists classify the artwork as part of what's known as the Barrier Canyon style, a tradition that appears across the region in fragments and isolated panels. Some of the figures at the Great Gallery resemble those in nearby canyons, elongated bodies, hollow eyes, ghost-like poses, but nowhere else is the scale or detail quite like this. The pigments, mostly red and brown, were ground from minerals and mixed with binders before being applied to the wall. The lack of carving suggests intention. This was not a quick mark or territorial sign, but an act of painting that required preparation, time, and a chosen location. Dating the figures has been one of the most persistent challenges. Some researchers once placed them as early as 2,000 or even 4,000 years before the present, created by nomadic hunter-gatherers who moved through this desert long before the rise of farming cultures. Others argue for a later origin, closer to the first millennium of our era, based on geological studies of the canyon walls and the way rock falls expose some of the panel's surfaces. If that later date is correct, the artist may have lived in a period of transition when older archaic traditions overlapped with early agricultural groups. The truth may lie somewhere in between. It is possible that the Great Gallery was painted in stages, added to over generations by different communities who shared the same landscape and perhaps some of the same beliefs. Differences in style between figures, some with intricate headdresses, others more minimal, suggest that the wall was not completed in a single moment. Instead, it may reflect centuries of visits, rituals, or seasonal gatherings. Each painter or group may have added to the story, even if we no longer know its meaning. And meaning is the real heart of the mystery. For decades, scholars have tried to interpret the ghost-like shapes. One of the strongest ideas is that these paintings represent spiritual visions or shamanistic imagery. The wide, empty eyes, the floating bodies, the animal companions, these are elements that appear in trance art around the world, created by people seeking connection with spirits or the supernatural. The canyon's remote setting supports this idea. It takes effort to reach this place. It feels set apart, almost designed for someone to step out of ordinary life and into something deeper. But even this interpretation is only a possibility. Others suggest the figures may represent mythic ancestors, culture heroes, or protective spirits tied to water and seasonal migration. Some believe the figures could be markers of identity or territory, though the absence of weapons, hunting scenes, or daily life makes this less likely. And there are those who remind us that interpretation can easily drift into projection. Without the voices of the people who painted them, no meaning is certain. Of course, more speculative ideas also circle around the Great Gallery. The figures' tall, tapered shapes and blank eyes have inspired claims about unearthly beings or lost civilizations. These interpretations travel far on the internet, but they sit outside what archaeological evidence can support. What is known, what is firmly grounded, is that the artists were human, living in a harsh desert environment, adapting to its challenges and expressing something important enough to paint at monumental scale. The canyon gives small clues to their world. Stone flakes, old habitation sites, and traces of plant gathering suggest a life shaped by mobility and seasonal patterns. People would have moved through these canyons following water sources, hunting animals, and harvesting seeds. Yet nowhere else in their daily material remains does anything appear quite like the Great Gallery. Whatever this artwork meant, it was not casual decoration. It belonged to a different sphere of experience: ritual, memory, belief, or transformation. Standing in front of the panel, the figures feel larger than their outlines. Some seem to look past you, others seem turned inward, as if caught in a moment of stillness you were never meant to witness. The longer you study them, the more details appear. The delicate shading around the heads, the fine lines of birds and snakes, the placement of smaller figures beside the tall ones as if in relation. The wall is a conversation, but one conducted in a language we can no longer speak. Today, the Great Gallery remains protected inside Canyonlands National Park. Reaching it requires miles of hiking and descending from the rim of the plateau into the hush of the canyon. The remoteness protects the site, but it also preserves its power. When travelers arrive, they often fall silent without being told. The canyon seems to ask for quiet. The figures ask for attention. You stand there looking at shapes that have survived for thousands of years, painted by hands that are long gone. You don't know their names, you don't know their stories, but you know they wanted to be seen, and here, in this canyon of stone and wind, they still are. 3 worlds on one cliff, Sego Canyon rock art. The first thing you notice in Sego Canyon is the way the walls seem to fold around you. The canyon isn't large, but it feels enclosed, like a natural hallway carved by wind and time. The light here changes quickly, thin in some places, bright in others, and as you follow the path along the base of the cliffs, the colours begin to shift. At first, the rock looks ordinary, the same pale sandstone seen all across this part of Utah, but then shapes start to emerge. A line here, a curve there, a faint silhouette, and suddenly the entire cliffside becomes a surface filled with presence. Sego Canyon does not show one era, or one group of people, or one style. Instead, it holds 3, all painted, carved, and layered on top of each other across nearly 4,000 years. It is one of the rare places where you can stand in front of a single wall and see the passing of cultures the way you might watch shifting clouds. What survives here is not a single story, but a sequence of stories, one built over another, each leaving marks that still speak even if their meaning has been lost. At the far left of the cliff, the oldest images appear first. They stand tall, some stretching over 6 feet, painted in reds and browns. The shapes echo the figures from Horseshoe Canyon, elongated bodies, wide eyes, and floating forms. These belong to the Barrier Canyon style, the work of ancient hunter-gatherers who lived in the region long before farming took root. The figures here share many traits with those at the Great Gallery: hollow eyes, narrow shoulders, ghost-like poses. But in Sego Canyon, some of the shapes are more abstract, more minimal, with fewer animals or objects surrounding them. When you stand close, small details sharpen: a crescent shape above a head, the curve of a horn, a faint line trailing from a figure's body. Some forms cluster tightly, others stand alone. The paint, though faded, still holds surprising depth. This earliest layer may be thousands of years old, perhaps 2 or 3 millennia, maybe more. And yet the figures remain the first thing your eye goes to when you look up at the wall. A few steps to the right, the style changes. The tall, ghost-like silhouettes give way to rounder shapes, thicker lines, and carved outlines. These belong to the Fremont people who lived in Utah from around 300 to 1300 CE. They farmed corn, lived in villages, and moved between hunting and agriculture depending on season and place. The Fremont panels in Sego Canyon introduce new forms. Shield shapes appear, round discs held by human figures. Some figures wear headdresses. Others carry what appear to be weapons or tools. Their bodies are shorter and more proportional than the armless floating forms of the earlier tradition. The Fremont images often mix carving and painting. The figures are pecked into the rock, then filled with pigments. The shields are especially striking, sometimes decorated with patterns, sometimes left plain. The shield-bearing figures might represent warriors, mythic beings, or protective symbols. Their exact meaning is debated, but the shift from the dreamlike Barrier Canyon images to the Fremont's grounded, human-centered forms is unmistakable. It marks a cultural transition, a time when agriculture, households, and larger communities shaped life in the region. And then the wall changes again. On the far right, the latest images appear. They're more recent than any others in the canyon, created by the Ute people sometime after the arrival of horses in the American West. These images show riders on horseback, people carrying shields, and animals such as bighorn sheep. You can recognize the stance of the horses immediately, the raised necks, the curved legs, the motion captured in single strokes. Some figures appear to wear feathers or carry lances, others seem to be hunting. The style is more literal, more narrative, reflecting moments that probably took place within the last several hundred years. These Ute carvings sit directly over some of the older images. In some cases, the newer carvings cut into the older paint. In others, the new forms float beside the old without touching. This layering is not accidental. It reflects a long-lasting significance of this exact spot. Thousands of years before the Ute carved their horsemen, the Fremont carved their shield figures, and thousands of years before them, the ancient painters of the Barrier Canyon style created their towering ghosts. What remains unanswered is why this one cliff became such a gathering point. The canyon itself does not look like a place of long settlement or abundant water. It is narrow, with scattered trees and dry wash beds. Yet something about the rock face, the slope, the exposure, the sound, must have called people back again and again. Perhaps the alcove shape made it ideal for painting. Perhaps it lay on the seasonal path used for generations. Perhaps the site held ritual meaning, or perhaps its significance changed with each group that passed through. To understand this place, imagine a time-lapse stretched across millennia. First come the early hunter-gatherers, walking up the canyon floor, stopping before a wide slab of sandstone and painting tall, mysterious figures that seem more spirit than human. The canyon is quiet, the climate different, the land unmarked. Centuries pass. Then small groups of Fremont farmers begin moving through. They carry seeds, dig storage pits, hunt deer, and tend corn patches. When they look up at the wall, the old ghost-like figures are already there. The Fremont do not erase them. They carve their own designs beside and sometimes between them. They had shields, patterns, tools, signs of a life more settled and structured. More centuries move on. The climate shifts, water changes course, villages grow and decline. The Fremont eventually leave the region, and new peoples enter. The old paintings weather but remain. Much later, after horses arrive in the west, Ute travelers come through the canyon. They see the same wall. The figures from the distant past still stand there. The Ute carve their own stories on top. Riders, hunts, symbols of the world now filled with movement and challenge. They join the sequence rather than erase it. Viewed this way, the wall becomes a kind of shared ledger, not of events but of presence. Each culture left its mark, aware or unaware of those who came before. The absence of a single dominant layer suggests that no group claimed the place exclusively. Instead, it served as a point of return, a landmark that retained importance across time even as cultures changed completely. Today, when you stand in front of the panels, the three layers of art do not compete. They blend, overlap, and coexist, each telling a different kind of story. The earliest figures speak of visions and ritual. The Fremont images speak of identity, protection, and community. The Ute carvings speak of mobility, conflict, and adaptation in a new era. The sandstone holds them all, and the canyon, quiet and narrow, still carries the feeling that people have been stopping here for reasons we can feel, but not fully explain. A wall of messages no one can read, Newspaper Rock. The road that leads to Newspaper Rock is quiet, winding through open desert toward a sheer wall of sandstone that rises without warning from the valley floor. There's no long hike, no deep canyon descent, no sudden reveal. You simply round a bend and there it is. A flat, darkened panel covered in markings so dense that the surface seems alive. Shapes overlap shapes. Lines cross over other lines, and figures crowd each other for space. At first glance it looks chaotic, almost like static, but the closer you step, the more the wall begins to separate itself into hundreds of individual voices. Newspaper rock earned its name because the panel resembles a crowded page filled with symbols. More than 650 petroglyphs, carved rather than painted, cover this stretch of desert varnish. The oldest markings may date back nearly 2,000 years, created by archaic hunter-gatherers long before settled villages spread across this region. Later carvings belong to basket maker and Fremont communities. Newer still are the images attributed to ancestral Puebloan people, and the most recent additions, unmistakable in shape and style, were carved by Ute artists after horses were introduced to the American West. What stands here isn't one message, but an accumulation of messages, layered slowly by people who walked this land across centuries. Each group used the same wall, the same smooth surface of sandstone, as if returning to a place that already held meaning long before they arrived. The figures vary widely. Human shapes appear with raised arms, some with headdresses, others with little more than a head and trunk. Animals are everywhere: bighorn sheep, deer, lizards and birds. Then there are the more puzzling symbols: spirals, squares, lines, arcs, footprints, handprints, and geometric shapes that resist clear interpretation. One animal appears with a long, curving tail, another with horns that stretch impossibly high. Some shapes seem abstract, others resemble tools or objects, but the meaning behind them remains uncertain. The wall itself helps preserve them. Desert varnish, a thin, dark mineral layer, forms over sandstone naturally, and by carving into it, ancient artists revealed the lighter stone beneath. Over time, new varnish grows and darkens the older carvings, while fresher marks appear brighter. This natural aging makes the panel look like a timeline, some figures crisp and new, others softened by centuries. But for all its clarity, the wall does not speak in a language we can translate. Unlike written scripts of ancient civilizations, these markings do not form an alphabet or direct sequence. They have no punctuation, no direction, no obvious order. Theories abound. Some scholars suggest the images served as hunting records or signals left for others traveling through this region. Others see ceremonial meaning, symbols tied to myth, ritual, or spiritual encounters. The density of the panel suggests repeated use, but whether the markings form a shared story or simply a long collection of individual statements remains unknown. The challenge of interpretation becomes clear when you study a section closely. A row of bighorn sheep might sit beside a human figure with raised arms, which in turn lies near a spiraled shape. Does the grouping have meaning, or is it coincidence? Did the artists intend the images to relate to one another, or did each carving stand alone? Without explanations from the people who made them, we see only fragments. Some observers propose that the figures could mark seasonal events or migrations. Bighorn sheep often trace routes that indigenous communities followed for hunting. Footprints carved into the surface may record travel or movement through the region. The presence of mounted riders in the newer, Ute-era carvings confirms that the site continued to receive visitors long after earlier cultures had faded. Yet even here, the meaning remains speculative. A rider might be hunting, travelling, or celebrating. A line connecting two symbols might indicate direction, or it might be purely decorative. The lack of clear answers fuels the mystery. Each image exists confidently, carved with intention, yet the message behind it remains locked. It is as if you found a book with every page covered in symbols, but no guide to decipher them. And Newspaper Rock is not alone. It sits in the northern edge of Indian Creek, a valley that forms part of a much broader network of rock art sites across southeastern Utah. If you travel east and south, similar panels appear in canyons and alcoves, some small, some sprawling, created by many of the same cultures that contributed to this wall. Some panels depict hunting scenes. Others focus on spiritual imagery. Still others show combinations that cannot be classified. Newspaper Rock seems to sit at a crossroads of these styles, a place where travellers from different times left marks along a shared route. In this wider context, the panel begins to look less like a single message and more like a communal board. People passing through Indian Creek may have stopped here deliberately, knowing this wall was already marked. Adding a carving may have been a way to acknowledge the place, leave a memory, or participate in a long-standing tradition. The fact that so many cultures use the same surface suggests continuity of significance, even as each group brought different beliefs, tools, and artistic styles. Imagine tracing a map from Newspaper Rock outward. Northward, you reach areas where Fremont villages once stood. Southward, you approach deep canyons filled with ancestral Puebloan dwellings. Westward, the land stretches toward barrier-style rock art. Eastward, trails connect into Colorado's rock basins. Newspaper Rock stands near the center of this web, as if marking a junction in the movement of people across the plateau. When you return your eyes to the wall itself, the carvings begin to echo this idea. You see not a single narrative, but many paths, lines branching, animals facing different directions, human figures spread across the surface like travelers passing by. Some images crowd tightly together, others are spaced wide apart. It is possible that each culture read the wall differently, understood different parts of it, or ignored sections that held meaning only for earlier peoples. There is no agreed-upon key to deciphering the panel. Archaeologists continue to study tool marks, patina changes, and stylistic traits. They classify images by era, technique, and cultural association. Yet even with this careful work, the meanings remain elusive. The rock is an archive without instructions. Standing in front of it today, the effect is unlike any other site in the region. The sheer volume of imagery draws your eye in every direction. You look at a single figure, and before you finish examining it, 3 more demand attention. It feels like stepping into a conversation where every speaker spoke in symbols, each message layered on top of the last, each carving influenced by someone long gone. The wall does not offer answers, it offers presence. It offers the knowledge that people stood here, carved into the stone, and moved on. The reasons remain out of reach, but the markings remain, gathering the voices of 2,000 years into a single crowded surface that still refuses to translate itself. The world's longest art gallery, 9 Mile Canyon. The road into 9 Mile Canyon begins without ceremony. A stretch of gravel, a few ranch fences, and a wide landscape of sagebrush that seems to go on without interruption. The canyon doesn't announce itself. It gradually pulls you inward. Mile after mile, the walls begin to rise, first low and broken, then taller, shaping a narrow corridor through the desert. Before long, the rock faces tighten around you, and the journey becomes less about distance and more about discovery. This is what people call the world's longest art gallery. Not a hallway of smooth walls, but a winding passage carved by water and time, lined with the marks of a civilization that has vanished. 9 Mile Canyon extends for more than 40 miles, though the name suggests otherwise. It contains thousands of rock art panels, petroglyphs carved into stone, pictographs painted with mineral pigments, created mostly by the Fremont people who lived in this region between roughly 300 and 1300 CE. Other marks belong to older archaic groups and later Ute visitors, but the Fremont presence dominates. The canyon walls hold family scenes, hunters, dancers, animals, spirals, abstract shapes, and symbols no one can decode. You can drive for an entire day here and still feel as if you have only seen a fraction. The journey forward feels like moving through a timeline. Panels appear suddenly as the road curves. At one bend you see a familiar image of a bighorn sheep, carved with sure strokes, its horns curling neatly above its head. At another, human figures hold tools or stand in lines. Then you turn another corner, and the wall fills with dozens of shapes layered across each other. The canyon does not present one panel of meaning. It offers a sequence, each one slightly different, each one carrying its own layer of mystery. As you continue driving, the first major stop appears, a panel showing a group of hunters with bows raised. The Fremont often depicted hunting, and the presence of deer and sheep in these scenes suggests both sustenance and ritual significance. The animals appear in various poses, running, leaping, turning back. Some figures seem exaggerated in size, others stylized. The hunters do not look like portraits. They are symbols of roles, not individuals. The canyon holds many similar scenes, but no two are alike. Each one seems to capture a moment, or perhaps a teaching without telling the full story. Farther up the canyon, the road follows the curving path of the old stream bed. Cottonwoods rise from the valley floor, their branches catching the light. Above them, more figures appear on the cliffs. In one section, a set of small human shapes stand beside rectangular patterns. These may represent homes, granaries, social groups, or ceremonial spaces. Archaeologists can connect some patterns to known Fremont practices, storage pits, farming areas, and small settlements. But the images themselves rarely offer direct answers. They are symbolic representations, not literal maps. The next stop brings you to one of the most famous panels in the canyon, the Big Buffalo. The figure is large, its body pecked deeply into the stone. Around it, smaller figures crowd the surface. Humans, animals, shapes that resemble shields or decorative markings. The buffalo's presence feels central, but its meaning remains unclear. It may reflect a successful hunt, a teaching story, or a spiritual symbol. The Fremont left no written records to explain the significance, and oral traditions from later cultures cannot fill every gap. The buffalo stands as an anchor, but the message remains hidden. The road climbs gently, and the canyon opens wider. Here, on a high wall, you find a panel that feels like a moment frozen in motion. A line of sheep followed by hunters whose arms are raised as if in pursuit. The figures grow smaller as they ascend the rock, giving the impression of depth. Some researchers describe this type of scene as a narrative, an event recorded in sequence. Others insist it may be purely symbolic. The Fremont did not carve their art as literal portraits. These were people whose lives were shaped by cycles of farming, gathering, hunting, and ceremony. Their art might connect to any of these. A few miles farther, another image stands out. The so-called pregnant woman, her body widened, her outline deeply carved. Two smaller figures stand nearby. The meaning of this figure has sparked debate. Some see fertility symbolism, others see social roles or family representation. Pregnancy appears in rock art across the region, but rarely depicted so clearly. Even so, no one can say whether this image marks an actual event or a cultural concept. You continue driving and the canyon narrows again. The next panel appears near a broken cliff where rockfall has exposed lighter stone beneath. Here you see something different. A cluster of shield-bearing figures, their round shields marked with crosshatch patterns. These are common in Fremont iconography, suggesting warrior roles or protective symbolism. Some shields carry intricate designs, others remain plain. The human figures behind them are stylized, often with square shoulders and triangular bodies. The meaning of the shields is debated. They could mark clan identity, social rank, or spiritual protection. The canyon holds many shield figures, and yet their purpose remains one of the most enduring mysteries. Near this section stands another striking image, a human figure with an elaborate headdress. The details rise sharply from the rock surface, the carving deep and confident. Headdresses in Fremont art often signal ceremonial roles or leadership, but they may also symbolize mythic beings. Without context, the figure stands alone, important but unreadable. The canyon widens once more, and the road swings along the base of towering cliffs. Here the marks multiply. Some panels contain dozens of overlapping glyphs. Others are spaced apart, each one set on its own patch of varnish. You begin to sense patterns. The Fremont returned to certain walls repeatedly. They favoured sheltered faces, stable stone, and spots visible from the road. These choices hint at intention. This canyon was not random. It was a corridor, geographically and culturally, used for travel, hunting, farming, and gathering. In the broader map of the region, 9 Mile Canyon sits between the high plateaus to the west and the more open desert to the east. It connects uplands, valleys, and water sources. People would have passed through here seasonally. Villages stood nearby. Farming plots dotted the wider region. The canyon may have served as a route linking communities. Panels marking family groups, hunting, or symbolic imagery likely carried meaning for travelers who understood the landscape in ways we no longer can. As you drive farther, more layers appear. Images of dogs, birds, geometric shapes, and strange figures with long, narrow bodies. Some shapes resemble nets or traps. Others resemble calendars or counting marks. The Fremont lived at a time of shifting climate, changing resources, and increased movement. Their art may reflect those pressures and choices, but without direct explanations, each panel remains an open question. The canyon walls grow steeper as the road rises toward the upper end. Here the final set of panels appear on high cliffs, requiring careful viewing from below. Some glyphs sit so high that they must have been carved from ladders or by climbing onto ledges. Their placement suggests importance. These high panels often contain complex scenes, animals, humans, patterns, crowded closely together. Each one feels like a final stop in a long sequence of messages. Driving out of the canyon, the road gradually widens again. The cliffs soften, the walls fall back, and the desert returns to its broad, open form. Behind you lies a gallery unlike any other. 40 miles of markings left by people who moved through this place for 1,000 years, each carving their presence into stone, each leaving behind a record we can see but cannot fully read. The vanishing Fremont. In a narrow valley of the Colorado Plateau, a people once built pit houses half buried in the earth, planted corn beside springs, and painted their presence across the rock walls. They are known today as the Fremont culture, an ancient society that rose, flourished, and then disappeared in the landscapes of what is now Utah and its margins. Their story is both an achievement and a mystery. The beginnings of the Fremont way of life lie in adaptation and change. Around 300 to 400 CE, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers in the region began to experiment with farming, particularly corn, beans, and squash. They supplemented traditional pursuits, hunting deer, gathering wild plants, with crops in small fields, storage pits, and granaries. Over the next few centuries, villages developed. Semi-subterranean homes, storage rooms, pottery, basketry, and rock art became part of the material expression of the society. In the heart of Fremont territory, you find villages where dozens of pit houses cluster around open courtyards and storage granaries. These homes had timber frames, earthen roofs, and sometimes stone foundations. Granaries, rectangular above-ground structures, held stores of corn and other crops. The people lived a mixed lifestyle, farming when conditions allowed, hunting and gathering when necessary. Their economy was not one of large cities but of scattered villages, often located near reliable water and arable land. Their rock art and figurines capture elements of their identity. The Fremont left behind unique grey ware pottery, moccasin styles, basketry with distinct motifs, and painted rock panels that show trapezoidal human figures, shield elements, and geometric designs. Their presence extended through the eastern Great Basin and the uplands of the Colorado Plateau, touching valleys, canyons, and plateaus alike. At their peak, roughly between 700 CE and 1050-1100 CE, Fremont society appears stable and vibrant. Farming worked, populations grew, and settlements developed. Researchers note irrigation ditches, field systems, and granaries indicate a deeper investment in sedentism than earlier hunter-gatherer groups. In places like Colorado, Utah, and western Wyoming, Fremont sites show substantial occupation. Yet by about 1050-1100 CE, the tide began to turn. Farming became harder, environmental conditions shifted, and villages were abandoned. By plus 1300 CE, the distinct Fremont way of life had largely vanished from the record. Some villages were empty, fields reclaimed by brush, rock art panels left unmaintained. The story is not one of abrupt collapse, but of gradual unravelling layered with complexity. The reasons for the decline are many and interwoven. Climate change played a major part. Decades of reduced summer monsoons, shifting precipitation, and cooler conditions increase stress on farming systems. A kind of double whammy scenario emerges: fewer reliable crops and more variable climate. Farming became riskier, particularly in marginal upland settings where the Fremont had long operated near ecological limits. Population growth may have compounded the problem. As more people adopted similar livelihoods in the region, resource pressures, wood, game, arable land, rose. At the same time, other cultures were in motion. Numic-speaking peoples, the ancestors of the Ute, Shoshone, Paiute, began migrating into the Great Basin and Plateau margins. These groups were more mobile and had broader subsistence strategies, better adapted to increasingly arid environments. Their arrival meant competition for resources or perhaps absorption of Fremont groups. Archaeologists ask, were the Fremont absorbed into incoming groups? Did some relocate south or east? Did others shift back toward hunting and gathering rather than farming? Today's evidence suggests all these scenarios likely played out in different places. For some Fremont villages, abandonment seems full. For others, later occupation layers suggest new groups moved in. Some rock art shows continuity. Other villages show blank gaps. Another factor is social change. The Fremont identity may not have been rigid. Scholars suggest Fremont might encompass several peoples, languages, and lifeways who shared certain material traits but varied widely in practice. As conditions worsened, village lifeways may have fragmented, families dispersed, links between settlements weakened, and investment in communal projects like irrigation or large storage may have declined. At the same time, connections to the broader southwest world shift. Pottery styles, trade in turquoise or shell, and rock art motifs show that the Fremont region was not isolated. Yet as the great Chacan systems in the southwest declined, the peripheral regions experienced ripple effects. Fremont areas may have lost trade links or ritual networks, increasing their vulnerability. In village after village you find granaries filled but rarely emptied, small fields abandoned, and houses used less frequently. Storage pits show signs of reduced use, midden piles grow thinner, mobility appears to increase again. These are signs of a society moving from settled farming back toward more mobile lifeways, not retreat as failure, but adaptation. Rock art provides a different window. The Fremont panels show shields, hunting scenes, human figures with ornate headdresses, and animals. These images reflect a society engaged in symbolism, identity, ritual. As the lifeways changed, the rock art may show shifts in meaning, scale, and audience. In places like Sego Canyon, Fremont art appears layered between older archaic and later Ute marks. In this sense, the Fremont sit at the midpoint of a long narrative of occupation, adaptation, and change. The disappearance of the Fremont does not mean extinction of people, but transformation of lifeways. No modern community identifies simply as Fremont, but descendant lines, cultural borrowings, and migrations thread through later peoples. Some scholars see links to southern Pueblo groups. Others emphasize the arrival of Numic speakers and the merging of traditions. The archaeological record resists a single answer. What remains clear is this: the Fremont people thrived for 1,000 years in an environment that required flexibility, ingenuity, and balance. They built villages, developed farming techniques suited to upland terrain, crafted art and material culture that still speaks to us. Then, in the face of climate, social, and external pressures, they chose different paths, mobility rather than settlement, moving away from villages rather than staying. Their choice may not show in dramatic collapse, but in quiet migration, change of maintenance, and disappearance of the recognizable village farming model. Today, when you walk among pit house ruins, granary foundations, corn cobs left in storage pits, baskets and moccasins, you glimpse a society in motion. You also see the absence of later layers, houses abandoned, fields gone. The stone walls and painted panels persist, but the everyday rhythms of that way of life have ceased. The Fremont left behind the tools and traces of their presence. The question remains, why did they leave in the end? And where did they go? A time capsule canyon, Range Creek's hidden Fremont villages. The rotors beat against the thin morning air as the helicopter lifts over the Book Cliffs. The ground drops away, revealing a maze of ridges, plateaus, and narrow canyons carved into the desert. From above, Range Creek looks unremarkable, just another deep cut in a landscape full of them. But as the aircraft glides over the rim and begins descending into the canyon, the walls close in, the colours shift to reds and browns, and the sense of isolation becomes unmistakable. There are no roads into this place, no easy paths, no signs of modern settlement. The canyon lies hidden, sealed off for generations by distance, geography, and luck. And because of that, a chapter of the Fremont world remains here, almost exactly as it was left 1,000 years ago. As the helicopter lands on a narrow bench, dust swirls across the clearing. The air is dry, quiet, and still. Stepping onto the ground feels like entering a place frozen in time. Range Creek Canyon was privately owned for decades by the Wilcox family, and before that it sat untouched, protected naturally by its remoteness. When archaeologists gained access in the early 2000s, they found something almost unheard of. Dozens of Fremont structures, granaries, storage rooms, and dwellings still intact. Some perched high on cliffs, some tucked into alcoves, some hidden so well that you must know exactly where to look to find them. Inside many of these storage rooms, ancient corn still lay in place, dried but preserved. Tools and artifacts had remained exactly where they were stored more than 8 centuries ago. The canyon floor spreads beneath you in narrow strips of grass, cottonwood trees, and sage. The Fremont people who lived here chose this place carefully. Water from the creek ran reliably, and the narrow valley offered protection. The canyon walls rise steeply, up to 2,000 feet in some sections, making access difficult. Travellers would have had to descend steep slopes or follow long, winding game trails. This isolation, which protected the canyon in modern times, likely served the Fremont as well. It allowed them to settle here with a degree of security, distancing themselves from conflicts or pressures happening beyond the cliffs. As you begin walking along the canyon floor, the first signs of Fremont presence appear almost immediately. Small rock alignments, old fields, and traces of pit houses now eroded into low depressions. Archaeologists identified numerous habitation sites here, enough to show that this was not just a temporary refuge but a sustained occupation. Families lived in the bottomlands, tending crops in the fields beside the creek, gathering wild plants and hunting deer in the surrounding hills. The pit houses were likely simple but sturdy, built partly underground to conserve heat. But the real astonishment lies on the canyon walls. High above the ground, sometimes perched on narrow ledges or tucked deep within shaded alcoves, granaries cling to the stone like hidden rooms. Many are built of stacked stones with mud plaster, the entrances sealed or partially sealed by slabs. The height of these granaries is striking. Some lie dozens of feet up, requiring careful climbing or ladders to reach. Others are accessed through cracks in the rock or by scrambling up steep slopes. This deliberate placement speaks to a strategy. The Fremont went to great lengths to protect their food from animals and from people. Examining these granaries, you notice the care in their construction. The walls are tightly fitted, the plaster smoothed by hand, the openings shaped to keep rodents out. In many, archaeologists found corn cobs, dried seeds, grinding stones, and tools. The isolation preserved them so well that some seeds still showed their original colour. It is rare in North American archaeology to find storage rooms with contents untouched. Range Creek offers that rarity in abundance. Walking deeper into the canyon, the story unfolds in stages. First, the rise. Families settling near reliable water, building homes, planting corn, managing seasonal hunts. The canyon's steep walls offered shelter from harsh winds and created pockets where sunlight warmed the ground longer in the day. This microclimate likely helped crops grow even when surrounding regions struggled. Then comes the peak, a developed system of granary networks, careful planning of food storage, and a stable village life. Evidence suggests that the Fremont here were not isolated in every sense. They likely interacted with neighbouring groups, traded, and followed patterns similar to other Fremont communities: seasonal farming, periodic movement, and a mixed economy of agriculture and foraging. But Range Creek also reflects something unique: a defensive mindset. The placement of granaries so far above the canyon floor suggests concern about theft or conflict. The Fremont in this region may have felt pressure from outside groups or may have simply lived in an environment where protecting food was essential for surviving harsh years. Some scholars propose that the canyon functioned as a retreat, a place used during times of stress, or a refuge for certain families. Others see it as a thriving village with defensive strategies built into its daily life. As you climb toward another alcove, you find yet another set of storage rooms, this time shaded and cool. The plaster still holds the fingerprints of builders. A few corn cobs lie undisturbed. The sense of abandonment hangs heavily. These people did not lose their homes suddenly in a catastrophe. Instead, they left, gradually. Their departure mirrors the decline of the Fremont world across Utah. Shifts in climate, drought cycles, reduced summer rainfall, and increasing unpredictability made farming difficult. Range Creek, despite its natural protection, could not fully escape these pressures. The Fremont here may have watched their crops fail more often, or they may have found hunting becoming less reliable. Perhaps other groups moved into nearby territories, altering trade or movement patterns. Whatever the cause, the result was abandonment. Not just of homes, but of carefully hidden food stores. Some granaries were filled when left behind. This fact stands as one of the greatest puzzles. These were not empty rooms. The Fremont did not clear them out. They left food they had worked hard to grow. Why would a people who took such care to protect their resources simply walk away? One possibility is that they intended to return but never did. Another is that the network connecting Range Creek to other Fremont sites no longer functioned, leaving these communities isolated. Or that drought cycles forced families into migration patterns that took them farther and farther from the canyon until returning became impractical. Range Creek's story ends quietly. No burned villages, no signs of conflict, no mass destruction. The people simply faded from the canyon, leaving behind the evidence of their work. The structures stood undisturbed for centuries, protected by geography and by a lack of intrusion. When archaeologists arrived, they found an almost pristine snapshot of a vanished society, its tools, its food, its storage systems, all preserved by silence and time. Standing on a ledge looking down the length of Range Creek, the canyon feels both empty and full. Empty of the voices that once worked its fields and climbed its walls, full of the traces they left behind tucked into stone alcoves waiting for discovery. Towers on the edge, Hovenweep and the canyon's watchers. The first light of morning reaches Hovenweep slowly. It arrives as a pale glow on the horizon, then spills across the mesas until it touches the edges of the canyons. As the sun climbs higher, the shadows pull back and the towers reveal themselves. Stone structures rising from boulders and canyon rims, some square, some round, some balanced so delicately that they seem to defy gravity. They stand quiet and unmoving, as they have for more than 700 years. No roofs, no wooden beams, no voices or footsteps, only walls of sandstone fitted with care, watching the empty spaces around them. Walking toward the first tower, the silence feels deliberate. The structure sits at the canyon's edge, its walls shaped from carefully stacked sandstone blocks. The stones are small but precisely chosen, each one smoothed and set to match the curve or angle required. The doorway, now open to the wind, once held a lintel stone. Inside, the circular room rises upward like a hollow column. From here you can see the canyon floor below, steep and narrow, lined with brush and scattered stones. Hovenweep is not a single site, but a collection of villages spread across the borderlands of southeastern Utah and southwestern Colorado. Each village contains towers, some perched on boulders, others built beside springs or tucked into alcoves. The people who lived here were part of the larger ancestral Puebloan world, farming corn, squash and beans, building homes of masonry, and shaping their lives around the rhythms of water and climate. Yet the towers they left behind do not match the typical architecture seen elsewhere. Here, the towers dominate the landscape. Moving along the rim, you approach another structure, a square tower balanced atop a massive boulder. The placement seems impossible. The foundation stone is rounded and tilted, yet the builders managed to anchor the tower firmly on top. From certain angles, it looks as if the whole thing could slide off with a strong gust. But it has stood here since at least the 13th century, surviving storms, erosion and time. Inside the village ruins nearby, you see rooms, kivas, and small walls that formed a community. People once lived and worked here, grinding corn on metats, tending fields, and storing crops. The towers rise above these more ordinary structures. They are the most visible, the most unusual, and the most discussed. What were they for? Why build towers on exposed edges where attack would be easy? Why place them beside springs or seeps when a simple sheltered room would have protected water better? Stepping through the remains of a round tower, you notice features that seem intentional. Narrow windows, slits really, cut into the walls. Some face the horizon in ways that align with solstices or equinoxes. Others frame canyon cliffs where the sun rises or sets during certain seasons. This has led some researchers to suggest that at least some towers functioned in part as observatories, marking solar events to guide agricultural cycles. The openings might have helped track the movement of the sun or provided reference points for ceremonial timing, but the explanations do not end there. The proximity of many towers to seeps and springs suggests another possibility: water protection. In a region where rainfall varies from year to year and drought can last for decades, guarding water sources would be vital. A tower beside a seep could allow lookouts to monitor usage, manage resources, or protect the supply during tense periods. The height and visibility of these towers would have offered clear vantage points over the canyon floor and surrounding mesas. Another interpretation sees the towers as defensive structures. Built near canyon edges, they could serve as lookout posts, watching for visitors or potential threats. The 13th century was a period of change across the ancestral Puebloan world. Population shifts, droughts, and social tensions influenced settlement patterns. In some regions, fortified sites became more common. Here at Hovenweep, the towers may reflect concerns about security, yet their positions are curious. Some stand in places that seem vulnerable rather than protected. This raises questions about whether defense alone explains their purpose. Some scholars suggest the towers served ritual or social functions. The careful masonry, especially in the multi-story structures, hints at symbolic meaning. These towers may have been gathering places, storage rooms for important items, or locations for ceremonies. One tower above a canyon contains interior partitions and shaped openings that seem less practical and more symbolic. The builders invested time and labour into making the towers architecturally striking, not merely functional. That investment suggests importance beyond simple storage or defence. As you walk to the next cluster, the canyon opens wide and the structures appear scattered across the rim. A large square tower stands paired with a smaller round one, both overlooking the basin below. The arrangement feels intentional, as if the towers communicated with each other across the landscape. Looking across the horizon, you can imagine how someone standing atop one tower could see signals or smoke rising from another. The region contains multiple village units separated by miles, yet the line of sight between many features is clear. Communication may have been part of the system. Moving closer, you study the masonry. Thin sandstone blocks laid in horizontal patterns, with chinking stones filling gaps. The tower walls are often double-layered, with the outer and inner walls tied together by carefully placed stones. This meticulous construction required skilled labour. Builders selected stone shapes, shaped corners precisely, and reinforced doorways with large lintels. These were not temporary or casual structures, they were meant to last. A few steps farther, a tower known as the Twin Towers rises in front of you. Two structures standing side by side, each with narrow windows, their walls curving gracefully upward. The symmetry is striking. The effort required to build two equally complex structures next to one another indicates a sense of balance, perhaps even symbolism. Some researchers believe structures like this held social importance, perhaps marking status or role within the community. Another site reveals a tower built directly over a boulder with a cavity underneath. The placement suggests that the cavity, possibly a seep, held valuable water. Here the tower's function could be tied to guarding the seep or managing access. But even this interpretation faces uncertainty. Why such a tall and complex structure for a purpose that a lower wall might have accomplished? As you continue moving through the landscape, the interpretations swirl. Observatory, granary, watchtower, shrine. The truth may combine all these roles. The towers may have served multiple functions across seasons or years. They may have shifted roles depending on climate, population changes, or social needs. Their meanings could have evolved, passed from one generation to the next, each adding a layer of understanding we can no longer access. The sun rises higher now, and the canyon brightens. From the rim, you look down at the dry wash where fields once grew. Corn pollen, grinding stones, and pottery fragments found at Hovenweep confirm a farming community. But the towers rise above the fields, above the homes, above the daily life. They command attention, their silhouettes cutting into the sky. Standing beside one of the tallest towers, you place your hand on the stone. The surface is rough but warm. The stones were cut and placed by people who understood their environment intimately, its seasons, pressures, and uncertainties. They built towers that watched the landscape, stood beside water, framed the sun, and anchored their villages to the canyon's edge. And they left them behind when the 13th century brought changes no one today can fully explain. The towers remain, silent watchers above the canyons, holding their secrets in stone, houses left hanging, bear's ears and cedar mesa cliff dwellings. The trail into Cedar Mesa begins on open ground, flat stone, scattered juniper, and a silence that feels wider than the horizon. Nothing at first suggests what lies hidden in the cliffs, but as you move closer to the canyon's edge, the ground starts to tilt, the air cools, and the rock opens into deep alcoves carved by thousands of years of wind and water. Only when you descend into these folds of sandstone do the shapes appear. Walls tucked into ledges, doorways in impossible places, and houses built so high and narrow that they seem to cling to the cliff like birds' nests. Across Bear's Ears and Cedar Mesa, these cliff dwellings appear in alcoves large enough to shelter entire households. Some of the most striking, Moon House, House on Fire, Perfect Kiva, and others, are suspended along the canyon walls at heights that require careful climbing. From a distance, they blend into the stone. Up close, they reveal the architecture of a people who chose to live not on the canyon floor, but above empty air. The builders were part of the ancestral Pueblo world, descendants of communities who lived across the Four Corners region for centuries. Their roots reach back into basket-maker traditions of the early first millennium, when small pit house dwellings dotted the mesas. Over time, these communities developed masonry techniques, pottery styles, kivas for ceremony, and sophisticated farming systems. By the 1100s, populations across the region had grown, villages expanded, fields of corn, beans, and squash filled the valley floors. Trails linked communities across canyons and mesas. But sometime in the late 1100s and early 1200s, a shift began. Families who had long lived in open pueblos started moving into cliffs, placing their homes in alcoves and on narrow shelves. These homes were not temporary shelters. They were full residences, equipped with storage rooms, hearths, kivas, and defensive features. Some rooms were painted with white handprints or geometric designs. Others had carefully shaped doorways, often T-shaped, a hallmark of the region's ceremonial structures. One dwelling stands out as an entry point into this world, Moon House. Reaching it requires navigating slick rock slopes, crossing narrow ledges, and rounding exposed corners. When you finally enter the alcove, the walls of the dwelling rise in a string of connected rooms. The main room still holds beams in the ceiling, plaster on the walls, and traces of soot above the ancient hearth. Just beside it sits a storage room sealed on the outside with plaster and stones, a reminder of how carefully the people guarded their food. In this dwelling, you find a single pot lying where it was last placed. It is cracked but still whole, its grey surface decorated with corrugated patterns. Inside the room are grinding stones, metates and manos, worn smooth by years of labour. The hearth holds the blackened remains of the final fire burned there. A few charred corn cobs lie beside it. This room is small, no wider than a few strides, but everything in it tells its own part of the story. To understand why these cliff dwellings were built, archaeologists follow evidence across centuries. During the early phases, households built pit houses on open ground. Later, they constructed above-ground pueblos on mesa tops. Only near the end of the occupation did families move into cliffs. This shift suggests changing pressures. Water sources grew less reliable. Drought cycles intensified. The warm, moist summers that once fed cornfields became shorter. By the mid-1200s, tree ring records show some of the most severe drought conditions in centuries. Farming grew more difficult. Depending on rain alone became dangerous. The move into cliffs may reflect a need for protection, both physical and social. Living high above the canyon floor made it easier to defend against raids or conflicts. The narrow ledges allowed only one person to approach at a time. Many dwellings used loopholes, small openings in walls, to watch the approach from below. Broken pottery scattered near entrance routes suggests that households intentionally controlled movement around their homes. But defense is only part of the story. The cliff dwellings also sheltered food. Storage rooms tucked deep into the alcoves kept corn safe from rodents, moisture, and extreme temperatures. The dry air and natural shade preserved stores for long periods. Some granaries still contain ancient corn cobs, their kernels long dried but their shapes intact. The cliff houses show signs of careful planning. In one dwelling, a small doorway leads into a room no larger than a closet. On the floor lies a single basket fragment, woven tightly. In the corner, somebody once left a drill made from a slender branch and a piece of chert. These traces reveal a household that planned for seasons, measured work, and prepared for times when food was scarce. But the canyon system holds more than domestic spaces. Kivas, round ceremonial rooms, sit in several alcoves, sometimes hidden behind walls. These were likely used for ritual, decision-making, and social gatherings. Their presence inside cliff dwellings suggests that families intended to remain in these structures for extended periods, not merely as emergency shelters. At the peak of occupation, the cliffs would have been filled with smoke, sound, and daily activity. Corn grinding, fire crackling, children moving between rooms, families climbing down to tend crops in the valley below, then climbing back up at night. Yet by the early 1300s, the alcoves emptied. Fires burned out, doorways collapsed, pots remained where they were last set down. The people left, just as they left other settlements across the Mesa Verde and Kayenta regions. Their migration was widespread, not isolated. Archaeological evidence shows that many families moved south and east. toward the Rio Grande, the Hopi Mesas, and other areas where communities grew during the 1300s. Why they left remains a question without a single answer. Climate stress certainly played a major role. The severe droughts of the 1200s made sustained farming nearly impossible. But social factors also contributed. Population shifts created tensions, trade networks changed. Some scholars argue that religious or spiritual decisions influenced movement, with families joining communities whose ceremonial practices were more stable or adaptable. Looking again at the room in Moon House, you see the story in miniature. The pot left behind was functional, not ceremonial. The hearth contains coals from an ordinary meal. The granary beside it still has traces of stored corn. These are not the signs of a sudden flight or violent end. They reflect a planned departure, a decision to leave, not an interruption. On a ledge just outside the dwelling, a row of handprints marks the wall. They are white, faint, but unmistakable. Handprints like these appear throughout Cedar Mesa. Simple marks of presence placed with intention. They bring the story back to the people themselves, to individuals who lived in these narrow alcoves, climbed these cliffs, tended these fields, and eventually chose a different path. Walking along the ledge, you can see other dwellings across the canyon, small openings in the rock where other families built their homes. Each alcove holds its own story, its own pot, its own hearth. Together they form a mosaic of lives caught in transition. The path below is quiet now. The houses remain hanging from the cliffs, holding the last traces of communities who lived through change, adapted, and ultimately moved on. Symbols in the West Desert, petroglyphs on the edge of survival. The West Desert doesn't begin with cliffs or canyons, it begins with distance. Flatland stretching outward in muted colours, sagebrush, saltgrass, and long corridors of pale soil shaped by wind. The farther you move into it, the quieter it becomes. No rivers flow here, only dry washes. No trees rise above the horizon, only distant hills. And yet, scattered across this landscape that seems almost empty, you begin to see signs of people who crossed it thousands of years before any modern trail was marked. At first, the markings appear faint, like scratches left by passing animals. But when the light cuts across the stone at an angle, the lines sharpen. A spiral, a set of dots. A bighorn sheep carved with curved horns. A human figure with arms raised. Each panel sits alone, sometimes miles from the next one, carved into limestone or quartzite boulders. The silence around them makes the carvings stand out all the more, marks that survived not because they were protected, but because almost nothing here disturbed them. These petroglyphs lie near the former shorelines of Lake Bonavville, the enormous prehistoric lake that once covered much of western Utah during the last ice age. When Bonavville receded, it left behind beaches, shorelines, and ridges that now form the edges of the modern West Desert. For thousands of years, people moved through this region, tracking its scarce water sources, following seasonal game, and leaving carvings at certain sites. The images belong to different eras: archaic hunter-gatherers, Fremont farmers, and later Ute and Shoshone groups, each adding symbols to the landscape. Imagine moving through this desert like they did. You follow low ridges and dry basins, crossing areas where the lake once lapped. The ground changes from hard clay to scattered gravel. When you approach a rocky outcrop, you see another panel carved into the face of a boulder. This one contains geometric shapes. Lines crossing at angles, a grid-like pattern, and circles arranged in a cluster. Archaeologists describe these as abstract forms, but the meaning behind them is unknown. They might represent trails, seasons, ceremonies, or something entirely different. From that outcrop, a straight desert track extends toward distant hills. If you follow it, another panel waits on a separate ridge. Here the carvings shift again. A row of sheep marches in a long line, each one carved with nearly identical curves. A human figure stands behind them, holding what might be a bow or simply a line meant to represent connection. Elsewhere, on the same boulder, a symbol resembling a sunburst is carved. Panels like this suggest hunting imagery, but whether these were records of hunts, prayers for successful hunting, or markers of migration paths remains uncertain. The West Desert's petroglyphs do not form a continuous gallery like those in 9 Mile Canyon. Instead, they appear as isolated messages, placed at key points in a vast environment: a spring, a ridge, a sheltered rock, a crossing point. One panel might sit near a rare water seep, its symbols carved deep into varnished rock. Another might appear on an elevated hill with a clear view in all directions. Birds, spirals, crescents, footprints, human forms and animals appear again and again, but not in a predictable pattern. A map of these sites would look scattered like stars across a dark sky. And yet certain clusters form loose routes. Archaeologists believe many of these carvings lie along ancient travel corridors, paths used for generations by people moving between the Great Basin and the Colorado Plateau. These routes were not roads, but well-known passages shaped by water sources, hunting grounds, and seasonal needs. The carvings may have acted as signals, reminders, or markers for those who already knew how to navigate these harsh spaces. Dating the petroglyphs involves studying patina, style, and tool marks. Some belong to the Archaic period, perhaps 6,000 years old or more. Others match Fremont styles, triangular-bodied humans, abstract symbols, or shield-like forms. Still others clearly reflect later Ute and Shoshone traditions, including mounted riders and recognizable weapon forms. But even when an image can be linked to a specific period, its meaning remains elusive. A carving of a sheep might symbolize a hunt, a clan, a ritual, or a story. A spiral might represent the sun, a migration, or a ceremonial path. The lack of written explanation means these symbols operate like a language without a translation key. Continuing across the desert, you reach an area where boulders scatter like broken pieces of an old shoreline. A set of carvings lies on the north-facing surface of one rock. A row of dots forming a line that bends twice, ending in a small circle. Nearby, a large animal form appears, its head and legs clearly defined, its body filled with pecked texture. The placement of these two carvings together might mean they relate to each other, but without context the connection is unclear. Another set sits miles away near a dry creek. The carvings here include both ancient archaic motifs and later Ute forms. This mixing shows that the same locations remained significant across thousands of years, even as different cultures used them for different reasons. Some researchers believe these shared locations reflect consistent environmental logic, springs, passes, or vantage points. Others propose deeper meaning, that certain places held ceremonial or spiritual importance long before the region's later inhabitants arrived. The debate over the purpose of these symbols mirrors broader questions in rock art research. Were petroglyphs meant for communication? If so, to whom? To neighbouring groups? To members of the same group? To spirits or ancestors? Or were they created during ritual acts with meaning embedded in the moment rather than in the image itself? Some argue that the carvings represent hunting magic, intended to influence success in difficult environments where game was scarce. Others suggest territorial markers, signs indicating which groups used which lands or water sources. Still others see them as memory aids, marking stories or events that were understood orally within a community. And some researchers propose that not all symbols were meant to communicate in a permanent sense. Some may have been expressions of identity or ceremony, created for reasons we cannot reconstruct. Walking between panels, you begin to see how the symbols connect to the landscape. The West Desert demands attention to small details. A change in soil colour might indicate a spring, a line of rocks might mark an old trail, a distant rise might signal the best route to cross a basin. The carvings often appear in these subtle places, as if aligned with the natural logic of the land. They might not have been messages for outsiders, but reminders or markers for those who already knew the terrain. Toward the end of the route, you reach a large quartzite boulder with carvings on all sides. Some are faint, nearly erased by centuries of wind. Others remain clear, a bird with wings spread, a human figure with a triangular body and a set of spirals carved deeply into the surface. This panel is one of the finest in the region, but no single interpretation fits it. It is a cluster of symbols without a known sentence, a fragment of a language we cannot read. As the sun drops, the carvings become harder to see. Shadows fall into the cracks, and the desert grows cold. Looking across the basin, you realise how much of this landscape remains unexplored. The petroglyphs are scattered markers of people who survived here through knowledge, adaptation, and mobility. Their symbols remain carved into stone on the edge of the desert, still waiting for a meaning no one can fully recover. 10,000 years in one cave, Danger Cave. Night settles early in the West Desert. The sky fades to a flat, colourless blue, and the wind slips across the basin in long, quiet currents. Ahead, at the base of a limestone slope near Wendover, a dark opening breaks the monotony of stone. It does not look impressive at first, just a shallow hole in a barren hillside. But when you step closer, the ground tilts downward, the air cools, and the darkness deepens in a way that makes the cave feel far larger than it seems from the outside. This is Danger Cave, one of the most important archaeological sites in the Great Basin, an archive of human survival stretching back more than 10,000 years. Inside, the cave mouth widens into a sheltered chamber. Archaeologists once used lanterns and torches to work here. Today, even with modern light, the sense of enclosure remains. The ceiling lowers toward the back, and the air holds a dry stillness created by centuries without moisture. Nothing grows here. Nothing rots quickly. The cave's arid interior preserved layer after layer of human presence. Basket fragments, chipped stone tools, plant fibers, seeds, animal bones, even desiccated human waste. Each layer forms its own chapter, stacked one upon another, a vertical timeline of adaptation. If you imagine descending into these layers, the cave becomes a time machine. The uppermost deposits closest to the surface date to the late prehistoric era, when the Great Basin's climate was already similar to today, dry, seasonal, unpredictable. But going deeper takes you much further back. The layers grow older, cooler, wetter, each holding traces of people who lived in different environmental worlds. The earliest layers, more than 10,000 years old, belong to groups who entered the region near the end of the last ice age. The Great Basin then was not the desert you see today. Cooler temperatures, larger lakes, and marshy environments provided habitats for waterfowl, rabbits, pronghorn, and plants that do not thrive here now. The people who used Danger Cave at that time relied heavily on marsh resources, reeds, cattails, seeds, and small game. Excavations revealed finely woven basketry that shows not only technological skill, but also an intimate knowledge of plant materials. Small stone tools and projectile points lie beside these early pieces. Some points resemble styles found across the West, hinting at broad movement or shared traditions. But the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to link these earliest inhabitants to later groups in the region. Their precise origins remain unclear. They may have descended from the ancient populations who spread across North America shortly after the end of the glacial period, but how they relate to later peoples, Fremont, Shoshone, Utah, remains uncertain. Moving upward through the cave layers, the climate around the Great Basin begins to shift. Lake Bonavville, the massive prehistoric lake that once covered much of western Utah, had long since receded. Marshlands disappeared. Dry basins replaced wetlands. The diet reflected this shift. Instead of marsh plants, people began relying more on seeds, nuts, and small desert mammals. Game hunting patterns changed. Stone tools adapted. The presence of grinding stones increased, indicating that plant foods required more processing as the environment grew harsher. Each layer in the cave holds evidence of resilience. These were small, mobile communities. They did not build large settlements or villages. Instead, they moved through the landscape seasonally, returning to caves like this one when conditions suited. Danger Cave was not a permanent home. It was a stop along a wider circuit, a place to shelter during certain parts of the year, a place where tasks were repeated generation after generation. Then the layers show something curious: gaps. Periods in which no new sediment, tools, or food remains accumulated. These interruptions suggest times when people did not return to the cave, even though they had used it consistently before. Why? Perhaps environmental shifts made the area less attractive. Perhaps groups altered their seasonal routes. Or perhaps different communities moved into the region, bringing new patterns of mobility. Later layers introduced new materials, bone tools with fine tips, pottery fragments in some sections of nearby sites, and more advanced hunting technologies. But even with these developments, Danger Cave shows continuity. People continue to rely heavily on wild seeds and small mammals. Agriculture never took root here the way it did in areas farther east. Even during the height of Fremont farming along rivers and canyons, the Great Basin remained a place defined by scarcity. The groups who used Danger Cave lived primarily as foragers, adapting to cycles of drought and abundance. One of the most striking sets of artifacts found in the cave is the collection of preserved coprolites, ancient human waste. In desert conditions, these do not decay. They remain intact, providing detailed information about diet and seasonality. When analysed, they reveal mixtures of seeds, fibres, small animal remains, and occasional traces of larger game. These findings show not only what people ate, but when they used the cave. The contents match certain plants that ripen in specific seasons, helping archaeologists determine the times of year when groups returned. As you picture the cave during these ancient visits, you see families gathered around low fires, using basketry trays to separate seeds from chaff, fashioning stone tools by lamplight, or storing bundles of plant material along the smoother parts of the cave floor. They would have known the desert intimately, where to find water after rainstorms, where herds travelled, and where food sources could survive harsh climates. But despite the richness of the archaeological record, many questions remain unresolved. One puzzle is the identity of the groups who used Danger Cave over such long periods. They left no permanent structures and no direct descendants who can be linked to them through written or oral histories. Their tool styles resemble those across the western United States, making it difficult to trace their specific cultural lineage. Another question arises from the long intervals in which the cave appears unused. Did small groups abandon the region entirely during certain climatic downturns? Did populations shift to areas with more stable water sources? Or did the cave fall out of use as cultural practices changed, only to be rediscovered later? The cave's position, overlooking what was once a resource-rich marsh near ancient Lake Bonavville, explains its early importance. But as the environment dried, the margin between survival and failure narrowed. Those who returned to the cave during later periods did so with increasingly refined strategies, wider foraging ranges, more flexible seasonal movements, and reliance on even smaller food sources. At the end of the timeline, the layers show a final shift. By the late prehistoric period, the groups using the region had changed again. These communities were likely ancestors of later Shoshone or other Numic-speaking peoples who spread across the Great Basin in the last 1,000 years. Their tools differ, their seasonal patterns differ, and their presence marks another chapter in the long sequence of adaptation. Standing at the mouth of the cave, looking back toward the basin, you can see how the land shaped every decision. 10,000 years of human presence are recorded in a single sheltered chamber because the desert preserved what time would normally erase. Each layer reflects a moment when people paused here, resting, working, surviving, before moving on across a landscape that demanded constant adjustment. 2 histories, 1 cave. Jukebox Cave from Paleo to What You 2. The entrance to Jukebox Cave doesn't look like a place where lives from different ages should overlap. It sits quiet on the slope of the Silver Island Mountains, a low opening carved into limestone, facing the dry basin where ancient Lake Bonavville once spread its water. The desert around it feels empty, almost untouched. But inside this cave, 2 histories sit on top of each other, separated by thousands of years, connected only by the ground beneath them. When you step through the entrance, the first thing you notice is the floor. Not stone, not packed earth, concrete. A smooth, flat pad poured in the 1940s by airmen from the Wendover Air Base during World War II. This cave was their unofficial recreation hall, a place to escape the heat and dust of the desert. They hauled a jukebox inside, hence the name, and used this chamber as a dance floor. Music echoed off these walls while bomber crews and mechanics took their turns on the concrete, laughing, smoking, and drinking after long days training in the desert. But just a little deeper into the cave, where the floor rises and the concrete ends, the noise of the 1940s fades. There, the earth is still layered with traces of people who lived here long before the idea of an airbase, or a jukebox existed. Archaeologists uncovered woven basket fragments, stone tools, broken projectile points, and fibres left by early hunter-gatherers who used this cave thousands of years ago. Some artefacts are similar to those found in the nearby Danger Cave deposits, though fewer in number and harder to date precisely. Still, they show that this place was part of the same long cycle of desert survival. Imagine picking up a small fragment of basketry from one of the ancient layers. The weaving is tight, made from plant fibres harvested from the basin. The piece is small and frayed, but the pattern is deliberate. It belonged to a container, maybe for seeds, maybe for transport, crafted by a person who knew exactly how much flexibility and strength they needed. This fragment is a tiny piece of a much larger story, a story that plays out in the materials beneath the concrete. Follow that fragment through time. Thousands of years ago, hunter-gatherers shelter here for a night or a season. They leave behind seeds and fibres, chipped stone tools and burned bone from small mammals. They may have cooked here, repaired gear, or stored food. The cave provided shade, protection from wind, and a vantage point over the ancient lake. At that time, the environment was far different. Marshlands, wetlands, and shallow waters surrounded the region where now only dry salt flats remain. People visited the cave because it sat on a boundary between habitats: fish and waterfowl near the lake, small game and plants in the uplands. Centuries pass, and the layers build slowly. Some periods show heavy use, others show nothing at all. These gaps puzzle archaeologists. They hint at shifting routes, changing climate, or evolving social patterns. While Danger Cave holds a deep, continuous record, Jukebox Cave's layers are thinner, more fragmentary, harder to interpret. Perhaps it was a temporary shelter used only in certain seasons. Perhaps it was a waypoint along a longer path. The deeper layers hold answers, but the clues are scattered and incomplete. Now imagine lifting your gaze from the ancient basket fragment to the smooth concrete poured only 80 years ago. That abrupt shift captures everything strange about Jukebox Cave. A space that served early humans as a shelter from the elements, and then, thousands of years later, served B-29 bomber crews as a break from the monotony of desert training. During World War II, Wendover Air Base was one of the largest training facilities in the country. Its crews practiced bombing runs over the vast desert basin. The isolation that once drew ancient families now drew military planners. The airmen explored the surrounding mountains and discovered the cave. They saw its shade, its acoustics, and its flat interior space. So they cleaned it out, poured a concrete floor, and dragged in a jukebox powered by a generator. On weekends, the cave filled with sound, swing music, chatter, the shuffle of boots on concrete. A few soldiers carved initials into the stone, others left bottles or cigarette tins in cracks. These remains mix with older layers, but the contrast is clear. 20th century debris on top, ancient debris beneath. Two worlds, one floor apart. Step back into the ancient section, beyond the reach of the concrete. The sediment here tells smaller, quieter stories. A chipped obsidian point carried from far to the west. A grinding stone fragment. Charcoal from a fire built long before recorded history. Together, these fragments show that prehistoric people returned periodically, but the record lacks the clarity found in Danger Cave. Perhaps the cave was used differently. Perhaps it served as a temporary refuge during hunts. Perhaps it was a stopping point along a trail that connected the Bonavville shorelines to upland basins. Archaeologists can estimate ages for some layers, thousands of years old, but cannot yet draw a complete timeline. They know the cave was used early, but not exactly when each group arrived or how they were connected to others in the region. The presence of basketry suggests ties to Great Basin traditions. The stone tools resemble those used by mobile foraging groups across Utah's western deserts. But no definitive cultural signature appears. It is as if the cave was part of a broader landscape of movement, used by many groups across long periods, but claimed by none permanently. Return again to the concrete floor, stand where the jukebox once stood. Picture airmen crowded into the cave after long hours maintaining bombers or practicing over the salt flats. Picture them dancing where hunter-gatherers once processed seeds. Picture them talking loudly where ancient families once whispered stories at night. The contrast highlights one of the cave's most striking mysteries: why this place, out of all places, carried so many overlapping uses. It was never a large settlement in prehistoric times. It was never a permanent facility during the war. It simply existed at the edge of a vast desert, sheltered enough to be useful for people separated by millennia. And so, the cave holds two histories side by side. One written in stone flakes, fibres and fire pits. The other written in concrete, boot scuffs, and music that has long since stopped echoing. The first stretches back more than 10,000 years, the second less than a century. Both remain incomplete, fragmented, and only partially recoverable. The cave does not privilege one story over the other, it simply keeps them, layered together, waiting for someone to notice how they meet in the dim light beneath the limestone ceiling. Footprints in a forgotten wetland, old riverbed delta trackways. The day begins with wind, slow, steady, brushing over the flat expanse of the old riverbed delta. The ground is pale and cracked, a desert floor that seems empty at first glance. Nothing moves, nothing hints at life. But just beneath the surface of this quiet basin lies a moment frozen more than 12,000 years ago, left behind by people walking across a wetland that no longer exists. The discovery began with something small. Two archaeologists surveying the land for traces of ancient activity noticed faint depressions scattered across the ground. The marks did not look like footprints at first, just shallow dents in the crust. But the pattern caught their attention. The spacing felt human. The shape felt familiar. As they moved closer, the details sharpened. Rounded heels, splayed toes, steps following one another in a tight line. It was a trackway, not a single footprint, then another and another. Soon they identified dozens, 88 human footprints scattered across the delta, each one the imprint of someone moving through soft mud thousands of years before the desert overtook this land. To understand the prints, you have to picture the world as it once was. This basin, which now lies dry and flat, was once part of a vast wetland fed by the remnants of ancient Lake Bonavville. Streams flowed here, feeding ponds and marshes. The ground would have been soft and waterlogged, rich with reeds, cattails and wildlife. When someone stepped into that mud, it held the shape of the foot. Then a layer of sand or silt washed over it, sealing the outline before it could erode. Over time, the wetland dried, the lake receded, and the desert advanced, but the footprints remained, hidden just beneath the surface. Focus on one set of prints. An adult stepped forward carefully, leaving a clear outline. The toes pressed deep, the arch left a faint curve, and the heel sank into the mud. Just beside it, a smaller footprint follows, a child's. The child walked close, keeping pace. Their steps are lighter, shallower, but unmistakably human. Together these prints show at least two people walking in the same direction, on the same patch of ground at the same moment. But beyond that, the story blurs. We do not know why they walked here. We do not know what they carried, or whether they were travelling between camps, gathering plants, or searching for game. No tools lie beside the prints. No hearths anchor the moment, only the steps remain. They give us a glimpse, but not the whole day. Archaeologists used careful excavation and ground-penetrating tools to reveal the prints without damaging them. Some prints sit several inches below the modern surface, hidden under layers of hardened crust. Each impression preserves details, pressure points in the toes, slight shifts in direction, places where the heel slid slightly in wet ground. These details tell us the prints were made by barefoot people. No sandals, no coverings, bare skin meeting mud. The spacing between the prints offers clues. The adults walked with steady strides, not running, not wandering. The child's steps match the rhythm, shorter, closer together, but moving in line. This suggests calm movement, not alarm or haste. The prints appear in clusters, then fade, then reappear, suggesting patches of mud interspersed with drier ground. They may have followed the water's edge, stepping into softer soil only at certain points. Beyond this, interpretation becomes uncertain. Were they part of a larger group? Possibly, but if others walked on firmer ground, their prints did not preserve. Did they travel toward a ridge, a spring, another valley? The landscape of 12,000 years ago was so different that modern landmarks offer little guidance. What we do know is that these footprints belong to some of the earliest people in the Great Basin. Their presence here confirms that humans moved across this region at the end of the last ice age, navigating wetlands, tracking animals, and adapting to environments that have since vanished. The prints show adults and children travelling together, suggesting family groups rather than solitary hunters. They show mobility across a changing landscape. They show a brief moment in the larger story of human migration into North America. But the prints also highlight how much has been lost. We cannot say what language these people spoke. We cannot name their culture. We cannot trace their descendants with certainty. Their tools, their shelters, their stories, none of these survived in direct association with the trackways. All that remains is the imprint of movement. Picture the adult stepping forward. The mud pushes between the toes. The foot sinks slightly, the weight shifts and the other foot rises. Behind them, the child steps in the shallow water, leaving a smaller mark. The air is cool, the marsh grasses sway, a bird calls, the sound echoes across the wetland. Then they walk out of the mud and onto firmer ground. From there, the trail disappears. The rest of their journey, Whatever they did, wherever they went, is erased by time. Standing on the delta today, with dry salt beneath your feet, you can look out across the basin and try to imagine that vanished world. The prints remain as ghosts of that landscape, the last traces of a place that once supported water, animals, and human lives. Each footprint is a message from people whose stories we cannot fully recover, a reminder that even the smallest marks can survive longer than the world that created them. Mystery mounds in farm country, the Nephi Fremont site. The first thing you notice in the Nephi Valley is the low hum of the land. The fields lie flat and wide, sun-washed, stretching toward the mountains. Scattered across the plain, little earthen mounds rise quietly from the ground, some no taller than a man's knee, others reaching chest height. Locals once called them Indian burial mounds, but by the mid-20th century archaeologists recognized them as the remains of a frontier farming village of the Fremont culture. These mounds mark the rise, life, and eventual departure of a community tucked between the Great Basin and the Wasatch Front. The rise of this village began roughly 1,000 years ago in central Utah, north of what is now the city of Nephi. The settlement lay in a transitional zone, not deep canyon country, not high plateau, but flat land that offered arable soil, access to water, and the possibility of farming. The farmers here carved square to rectangular houses partly underground, pit houses with timber posts and logs, and built surface storage rooms, granaries, and irrigation features. Excavations revealed at least 5 pit houses beneath the largest mound, one large structure of unknown type, multiple surface structures, and storerooms attached to homes. Some wood fragments in the excavated structures were radiocarbon dated between roughly 780 and 920 CE, though later analyses suggest the main occupation may span the 1000s. The buildings show typical Fremont architecture: adobe or stone foundations, storage attached, surface rooms, and fields near water. As the village grew, so did its commitment to farming. Corn, beans, and squash appear in the region's record. Storage pits and granaries reflect harvests beyond immediate consumption, surplus or buffer crops. The community built near perennial water and utilized small irrigation ditches or flood water fields to make the most of limited rainfall. The settlement appears as a frontier instance of Fremont farming, smaller scale than the large canyon villages, more marginal but still invested in agriculture. Pottery found here shows connections to wider Fremont networks: grey ware, some painted types, tools that echo regional styles. Walking over the mounds today, you find depressions where houses once stood, storage rooms where granaries once guarded crops, and shallow ditches that once carried water. One mound holds 5 pit houses and a surface granary attached to a dwelling. Nearby, 4 surface storage rooms line a block. The arrangement suggests families living together, storing crops, managing households. It reveals that even on the margins of the Fremont world, farming mattered. The village represents a blending of hunting, gathering, and farming adapted to local conditions. But the story does not end in prosperity. Around 1100 to 1200 CE, evidence suggests the village waned. Some storage rooms appear sealed and unused. Granaries remain filled and untouched. Houses sit collapsed. Fields show signs of less maintenance. The scale of farming appears to decline. The desert margin pushed harder. Rainfall became less reliable. Farming in this transitional zone proved more fragile than in richer valleys. Some researchers identify this village and others like it as the northern periphery of the Fremont world, where agriculture was always marginal and vulnerable when climate or social conditions shifted. And then the complete picture blurs. The village disappears from the record. We do not see a dramatic destruction layer, a burnover, or a mass migration stack. What we see are fewer households, fewer surplus farms, fewer connections to wider exchange networks. The frontier village on the plain fades out of the landscape. The people either moved, adapted toward more mobile lifestyles, or merged with others. Their fields returned to scrub. The mounds remained. This disappearance raises questions about how this community fit into the broader Fremont network. Some archaeologists argue that the Nephi village reflects a local adaptation of Fremont farming, smaller scale, suited to a marginal environment. Others emphasize that the site's architecture and pottery show clearer ties to local traditions than to major Fremont centers, suggesting the village may have been semi-isolated, a hybrid of forager and small-scale farmer. Debate continues about the function of the mounds themselves. At first, they were misinterpreted as burial sites, in part because mounds elsewhere are associated with graves. Excavations revealed, however, that many of these mounds contained storage rooms and house foundations rather than large cemeteries. This means the difference between burial mound and house mound becomes critical. The term mound in this context is more about accumulation of habitation debris and structural remains than about funerary architecture. Another question concerns social organisation. How did a small farming community on the frontier manage storage, coordination and exchange? Did they act independently or maintain ties with larger Fremont centres? The pottery suggests some exchange, but the village's scale and location suggest semi-autonomy. Some scholars propose the Nephi site was part of a chain of smaller communities that extended farming into the fringes, offering a buffer zone between major Fremont core areas and purely foraging groups. The viability of farming here required trade and mobility too. Climatic models show that precipitation in this region varies significantly. Farming in the plain meant risk. Storage becomes essential. The presence of storage rooms and granaries at Nephi points to that awareness of risk. Yet the eventual decline suggests that even these measures were not enough when conditions changed. The community's architecture reflects this. Granaries attached directly to homes, storage included in settlements, rather than distant centralized facilities. The social logic of a small village adjusting to risk. As you walk past the mounds now, you see superficial patterns, raised ground, depressions, stone scatter, but beneath that ground lie the foundations of houses, walls, hearths, storage rooms. The artifacts found, tools, pottery, corn remains, pose further questions. Were the farmers here growing as much as they needed? Were they supplying surplus for trade? Did they integrate hunting and gathering more heavily than village sites in richer lands? Many suggest yes. The Nephi community was mixed economy, small-scale farming supplemented by foraging. What remains unclear is when and why the village ceased to thrive. The decline of farming on the northern fringe of the Fremont world is well documented in other sites. Changing climate, population movements, more mobile groups asserting influence. At Nephi, the same pattern may apply. Marginal environment, less reliable crops, declining surplus, increasing mobility. Some archaeologists propose that the village residents gradually shifted back to more mobile lifestyles, leaving the fields behind rather than collapsing suddenly. One engaging puzzle at the site is the irrigation evidence. The shallow ditches and field alignments imply water management, but the full extent of those fields is unclear. Some field plots may belong to earlier occupation phases, some to later. The timing of field expansion and contraction is still debated. Additionally, the house structures show variations: pit houses, surface rooms, storage complexes. This structural diversity may reflect adaptation over time, shifting social strategies. The Nephi site offers a microhistory within the greater Fremont narrative, rising in marginal land, innovating with farming, storing crops, building houses and granaries, then declining, shifting, disappearing. For this community, adaptation met limitation. For the broader Fremont world, the site speaks to the edges, communities operating at the margin of agriculture, where social and environmental risk was higher. As you leave the mounds behind and walk across the valley toward the mountains, the land recedes, but the question remains. The boards of those ancient houses, the stones of granaries, the few hundred sherds of pottery, they all point to people whose lives balance between farming and foraging, between settlement and mobility. The Nephi mounds lie quietly now, but in their earth and stone they store evidence of a village horizon, of humans pushing farming northward, then choosing differently when conditions changed. Carpet of dinosaur tracks, the Moab mega-track site. Dawn creeps across the slick rock slabs north of Moab, casting long shadows across surfaces marked by shallow hollows, ripples, and fossilized footprints. With each step you take, the rock feels ancient, so old your boots barely leave a trace. Yet embedded in this stone are the impressions of creatures that walked here some 150 million years ago. This is the territory of the Moab mega-track site. A carpet of dinosaur tracks stretching over vast expanses, a record of life long vanished but preserved in startling clarity. Pick out one trackway. A line of three-toed footprints curls across an angled slab of sandstone. The toes are splayed. The heel remains shallow. The stride between prints is long, indicating the tracemaker walked with speed. The genus is not certain, but the tracks resemble those of large theropods, upright bipedal predators. The slab holds dozens of footprints, some overlapping, evidence that this place was used repeatedly. Scientists estimate the megatrack site covers at least 100 square miles, possibly more than 300 square kilometers. The footprints lie in the Entrada-Somerville sequence of Jurassic sandstone, deposited when this region lay near an inland sea, tidal flats, and shifting sand dunes. Imagine the scene as it was: a vast coastal plain, shallow sea to the east, wide rivers draining westward, mudflats where sand and silt settled after tides or floods. A large theropod walks across the wet sand, each step sinking into soft sediment. Perhaps it is hunting, perhaps it is pacing. Smaller tracks, ornithopods, maybe even early bird ancestors, appear nearby. The footprints are frozen for more than 100 million years. Then the sandstone hardened, uplift occurred, erosion stripped away layers, and the tracks once buried again surfaced for us to find. As you follow the trackway, you notice subtle changes. The prints deepen slightly where the slab dips, some prints overlap earlier ones, others sit clear in fresh rock. These variations suggest the surface remained soft yet stable for a time, enough for repeated visits by dinosaurs. The abundance of tracks leads paleontologists to infer that this region was a dinosaur highway of sorts, a place many creatures passed through, possibly herding, migrating, or feeding in numbers. But the megatrack site raises larger questions. Why did so many tracks preserve here? What made this location exceptional? One clue lies in the geology. The sedimentary layers show ripple marks, mud drapes, waveforms, and fluvial crossbeds, all indicating a shallow water or tidal setting at the time of track making. The soft substrate held footprints, then rapidly buried them to prevent erosion. Later, tectonics tilted the layers. Erosion exposed them. These conditions, rare though they are, created a preservation-perfect storm for tracks. Yet we still do not know exactly how the creatures used this landscape in life. Were they hunting solitary, moving in groups, escaping predators, or following prey? Choose another slab, a different trackway. This one shows a cluster of medium-sized three-toed prints, arranged in parallel lines. Some archaeologists interpret such alignments as evidence of group movement. Several footprints share nearly the same directional vector. Could this indicate herding behavior? Perhaps a pack of theropods, or several individuals walking together? If so, these tracks hint at social behavior in dinosaurs, something long speculated but rarely captured so clearly. However, caution remains. The substrate can distort impressions. A heavy step might deform the ground. A single dinosaur could walk multiple times. One footprint can be repeated and miscounted. The track maker might be unknown. The lines we draw could reflect chance rather than behavior. This underscores the challenge. The tracks are real. The creatures walked here. But what they were doing and why, they cannot tell us unambiguously. Farther across the megatrack site, you find trails made by sauropods, long-necked, massive herbivores whose weight pressed deeply into the mud. These prints are different, rounder, deeper, spaced further apart, sometimes showing tail drag marks. One sauropod trackway at the Copper Ridge track site, part of the broader Moab area, turned sharply at one point. Researchers suggest the animal changed direction sharply, perhaps startled, perhaps pursuing something. Another site records unexpected variations in stride length, raising speculation about injury or limping. When you study the stone closely, you notice the surrounding rock surface. Ripple marks show flow directions. Faint mud cracks suggest alternating wet and dry conditions. The stone contains ripple-laminated sediment. Sand fills in depressions. These provide context. A dinosaur walking across a tidal flat, steps sinking into wet sand, tide receding, sand-burying prints, subsequent layers sealing them. The environment transformed, sediment hardened, millions of years passed, erosion exposed the trackway for us to see. Walking across this rock face today, you trace one print after another. You imagine the moment of creation, toes flexing, claws marking, weight moving forward, sediment deforming. The track becomes your guide. Step in place. Feel how the ground might have given underfoot. Visualize the dinosaur. The creature disappears almost immediately, but its path remains. The prints become a character in this story, silent but expressive. Yet the prints do not close the story. Much of the detail is missing. We do not know the individual animal's identity, nor its motives. We cannot reconstruct an entire day of its life. We cannot confirm whether those parallel lines were individuals moving together, or simply overlapping from repeated use. We cannot read its thoughts. The tracks offer data but not the script. The Megatrack site is thus a landscape of frozen motion and lost intent. Each print a moment in time, each trackway a fleeting journey inscribed in stone. Scientists map them, classify them, measure stride and print length to estimate size and speed. Some tracks indicate walking speeds, others imply running. One study compared stride lengths to estimated foot lengths and suggested one theropod may have moved at nearly 5 meters per second. Yet these are estimates. The trackmaker's species remains uncertain. The behavior puzzle remains open. Standing on the tilted rock, you look out toward the La Salle Mountains in the distance. Imagine the inland sea edge to the east. You sense the deep time. The sandstone slab under your feet was once horizontal, buried under hundreds of feet of sediment. Uplift folded the rock. Erosion removed overlying layers. What you see is both ancient and recently handed to you by geology. The dinosaurs are gone, but their steps remain. The Moab Megatrack site challenges us to bridge two disconnected worlds, the one we walk today and the one they walked long ago. It anchors dinosaurs to terrain we can visit. It lets us say, here was a path, here was movement, here was a choice. And yet, so much remains unknown. The prints are frozen questions as much as their answers. Follow the trackway toward Older Rock. The further you trace, the larger the prints, each one deeper, each one stretched longer. The slabs tilt steeply now. Through polarized light or wet rock you see layering of sand and silt, indicators of currents, perhaps shallow water that flowed just after the prints were made. Adjacent to the trackway lie ripple marks, indicating wave or wind action. These contextual features anchor the prints in their moment, but still do not fully explain it. Another footprint lies beside them. Small, three-toed, perhaps juvenile. It overlaps a larger track. Was the juvenile following the adult? Did they stride together? Did one mentor the other? Or is this simply coincidence? The stone cannot decide. It only preserves impressions, and the area doesn't end. The Megatrack site spans vast distances. It holds multiple sites: Copper Ridge, Mill Canyon, Bull Canyon Overlook, Poison Spider, Dinosaur Stomping Grounds. Together they compose one region of extraordinary footprint preservation, a carpet of steps laid down in the Jurassic, exposed now to our gaze. Yet the why remains partially speculative. Why did so many dinosaurs make tracks here? Was this a watering area? A coastal plain they used repeatedly? Was the substrate particularly suited for tracks, soft, wet, then quickly buried? Or did the topography funnel movement along certain pathways, much as we follow trails today? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. The models remain contested. In this way, the trackway becomes less a solved case and more an invitation. You stand at the edge of time, tracing toes and heels, hearing no sound, seeing no creature yet feeling the motion. The dinosaurs moved here once. Their steps became stone. You follow them. You ask questions. They leave you at the threshold of an ancient world, one you can touch but not fully inhabit. When dinosaurs crouched in Swamp St. George Dinosaur Discovery Site, a thin beam of light filters through a skylight in the museum at the St. George Dinosaur Discovery Site's sheltering roof and illuminates a slab of sandstone crowded with footprints. One print catches the eye, larger than the others, but faint at its back edge. The toes are clear, the heel smudged. Near it, the same footprint appears again, slightly overlapped, its outline deeper. This is the crouching trace, a rare fossil trackway showing a dinosaur paused, bent its legs, pressed its body into the mud, and then rose to walk away. Because of this single slab, we enter a story of behavior, of pause, of motion resumed, an invitation into something we will never see firsthand. Step into the ancient world. Roughly 200 million years ago, the area around what is now St. George lay near a shallow lake and river system, part of the Moab Formation. Floodplains, sandbars, mudflats and shallow water intermixed. Some dinosaurs walked across wet sediments, left footprints, tail drags, and even crouched postures. Over time, these surfaces were covered by sand, hardened, uplifted and preserved. At this site, at least one theropod dinosaur paused in the wet mud, its body imprint preserved alongside its footprints. The crouching trace is exceptional. It shows impressions of the ischial callosity, the part of the pelvis that rests when a bird sits, tail drag marks, hand imprints. It is one of fewer than a dozen such traces documented globally, and yet the broader details of the creature remain unknown. Its species, why it crouched, whether the behaviour was common. Imagine the trackway as a mini-story. First step. The dinosaur moves forward across soft mud. Second, it slows, lowers its body, perhaps resting, watching, waiting. The handprints mark where it touched down. The tail drags slightly behind. The weight of the body pushes into the sediments more deeply than a step. Then it rises again and walks on. Another track. Longer stride, shallower depth. The moment is brief, but preserved in stone. In front of you, the slab reads like a dramatic pause in motion, a snapshot of a moment when the dinosaur bent itself from walking posture to crouch, then resumed walking. Tracking the footprints beyond this slab opens up other questions. The trail continues. Deeper impressions give way to shallower ones. The stride length increases. Some prints show claw impressions, others only faint. Some parallel lines nearby might indicate other creatures walked the same route. Did the dinosaur crouch to drink? To hide? To inspect something on the ground? We cannot say. The trace gives options, not certainty. Scientists debate the possible interpretations. Some view the crouching trace as evidence of bird-like behaviour in early theropods, the way birds lower their bodies before takeoff or feeding. Others argue the mud surface was slippery or unstable, and the dinosaur crouched to stabilise itself. There are also suggestions the dinosaur may have been swimming or wading. Prints in mud with ripple marks suggest shallow water. Some slabs at St. George show swim tracks, elongated impressions where feet paddled rather than walked, tail drags marking direction, scratch marks indicating claws. One paper describes that at the St. George site a swim track preserves an animal, using its hands and feet beneath water, leaving a pattern similar to modern water birds. At the same time, the crouching trace is isolated and deep in study, showing the posture and body impression of a theropod emerging from water or soft ground. The variety of traces at the site, running, walking, crouching, swimming, shows behaviour more complex than often portrayed. But the mystery remains. How frequent were these behaviours? How typical for the species? And which species produced them? Another debate refers to trackmaker identity. Some footprints at St. George align with Gralator-type tracks, smaller theropods. Others resemble Eubrontes-type prints, larger predators. The crouching trace has been attributed to a medium-sized theropod, possibly related to Dilophosaurus or Megapnosaurus, but certainty is absent. Without associated bones, trackmakers remain guessed. The morphology of the tracks allows estimates of size, stride length, foot size, yet nothing links them to a known skeleton. So while the crouching print may show a specific dinosaur, the species name remains a hypothesis. Moving beyond the crouch, the trackways at the site show swimmers and waders. One section shows parallel marks extending across wet sand, then fading into a shallower layer, interpreted as a dinosaur entering shallow water, swimming for a short stretch, then regaining firm footing. These traces situate the environment not as desert, but as a lakeshore or swamp margin where dinosaurs manipulated the fringes between land and water. Plant fossils, fish teeth, and ripple marks confirm this interpretation of the environment. Yet even with this contextual clarity, many details elude us. We cannot know if the dinosaur crouched because it hunted, rested, cooled off, or simply slipped. We cannot know how many times such crouching occurred across different species. We cannot know whether the swim tracks were frequent alternate behaviour or rare experiments. The combination of crouch, swim, walk, and run at one site suggests complexity, but the sample remains limited. Walking through the museum, you pause at a display showing the crouch track and a life-sized model of a theropod rising to walk away. You sense the moment captured, not just a print, but a posture, a behaviour frozen in rock. You sense the questions too. Why here? How common? What did it mean? The trace gives a story with missing pages. In one area, you view a slab with 3 long parallel tail drag marks next to standard footprints. They veer off to one side, then join the main trackway. Scientists interpret these as a dinosaur changing direction, possibly startled or pursuing prey. Others suggest the tail drag occurred because the animal was crouching or slipped. The interpretations overlap. the evidence remains the same. Motion, pause, motion. One of the site's strengths is its preservation of details, skin impressions, scale patterns, claw marks, even impressions of feet sinking into wet mud. These allow paleontologists to explore dinosaur posture, gait, speed, and weight distribution more precisely than many other sites. The crouch trace remains the piece de resistance because of its completeness. It offers 4 limb impressions, body contact and tail drag, features seldom preserved together. And yet we still ask, how many animals crouched like this? Was it unique to this individual or species? Were other behaviours similarly uncommon but simply not preserved elsewhere? The rarity of complete crouch traces, less than a dozen worldwide, suggests either the behaviour was rare or the preservation conditions were exceptional. Either answer is significant. As you leave the exhibit and imagine the dinosaur's motion, legs bent, body low, tail dragging, you realise that what you have witnessed is both extraordinary and incomplete. The trace invites you into a moment, but the moment dissolves as you move on. The dinosaur continued, the landscape changed, and time passed. The prints, the tracks, the traces, they remain. The identity, the full behaviour, the life behind the motion, they evade our grasp. Fossils with faces, Utah's Cambrian soft-bodied faunas. The limestone slabs of western Utah look ordinary at first glance. Flat, grey, and silent. But when you lift a thin sheet of rock split cleanly along its bedding plane, a different world stares back. A trilobite rests there, its eyes still raised, its segments crisp. And beside it lies something stranger, the outline of a soft-bodied creature, a delicate shape rarely preserved anywhere on Earth. What you hold is a window into the Middle Cambrian, more than 500 million years old, from formations like the Wheeler, the Margam, the Spence and the Weeks. These sites preserve animals that normally decay within hours, leaving almost nothing behind. Yet here, somehow their faces, limbs, gills and feeding structures remain. Picture an ocean unlike today's. During the Middle Cambrian, this region of Utah lay beneath a shallow sea, warm and rich with fine sediment. Life was exploding in diversity. Trilobites scuttled across the seafloor, soft predators drifted above, worm-like creatures burrowed below. Many had no hard shells, no bones, nothing that should withstand time, yet their bodies appear in Utah's rocks as clearly as fingerprints. Some show spines, others reveal feathery appendages used for swimming or feeding. A few even preserve the subtle curve of digestive tracts. The fossils rival the Burgess Shale of Canada, often considered the gold standard of Cambrian preservation. Now imagine the seafloor. Sediment drifts downward, fine particles of silt and clay stirred by storms. Occasionally an underwater slump sends a pulse of mud sliding across the seabed. When that happened, animals were buried quickly, sealed in low oxygen layers where decay slowed. In some cases, minerals replace soft tissue rapidly, preserving outlines before rot erased them. But pinpointing the exact combination of factors, sediment rate, water chemistry, microbial activity, remains one of the enduring mysteries of these formations. Consider a specific fossil, a lean, finned predator known from Utah's Cambrian beds, with grasping appendages extending forward. Its outline suggests a swift swimmer, a hunter. The fine detail implies the mud sealed around it almost instantly. But how quickly? Seconds? Minutes? Paleontologists debate this. Some argue rapid burial by underwater mud flows. Others suggest slower processes where microbial mats stabilize the remains long enough to permit detailed preservation. The mechanisms remain contested because the rock record shows many variations. Some fossils deeply detailed, others faint or distorted. Move across the slab. Here you find a sponge-like creature almost flower-shaped. Next to it lies a trilobite so detailed you can see the tiny pits where its compound lenses once were. In other parts of the Wheeler Formation, entire communities lie preserved together. Predators, scavengers, larvae and sediment feeders, all frozen in a moment. But reconstructing what these communities looked like in life is difficult. Were these animals living side by side on the same patch of seafloor? Or were they transported from different habitats during burial? Some evidence suggests life assemblages. Other features, like mixed species not usually found together, suggest a blending by currents. Geologists study the surrounding sediment layers. They see laminations showing quiet water conditions. They see slumps indicating sudden collapse of sediment. The chemistry suggests low oxygen at certain times, high in others. Conditions change from place to place. This complicates interpretation. A fossil with excellent detail may have died where oxygen was low and decay slow. Another may have been transported. Still others might represent ordinary seafloor communities caught during environmental shifts. Walk through time in your mind. 505 million years ago, trilobites dominated these oceans. Soft animals existed too, but we know them mostly from rare sites like these. The Wheeler Formation, for example, yields sponges, arthropods, worms, and even chordates in some sections. The margin provides more diverse forms, some with long feeding appendages, others with shield-like heads. The Spence Shale reveals larvae and juveniles, offering clues to life cycles. The Weeks Formation includes some of the latest Middle Cambrian life in the region, adding new species to the puzzle. Together, these formations reveal not just isolated animals, but entire ecosystems. Yet, there are still large gaps in understanding how these ecosystems functioned. Look at a classic example, a fossil arthropod with multiple pairs of legs, fine bristles, and a segmented trunk. Its preservation suggests flattening occurred without major distortion. Some scientists argue that soft-bodied organisms collapsed under the weight of sediment but retained enough structural support from their tissues to maintain shape. Others argue early mineralization, perhaps mediated by bacteria, stiffened the body before flattening. Electron microscopy has revealed minute mineral films in some fossils, supporting the rapid mineral replacement theory. But not all fossils show this. Some appear as compressions only. The evidence varies across sites. This leads to another question. Did all these formations share the same preservation conditions, or did each develop unique pathways? The Wheeler Formation has abundant, fine-grained sediments and is famous for trilobites. The margin records deeper water conditions with more diverse soft-bodied forms. The Spence Shale often shows signs of storm influence. The Weeks Formation lies at the transition to later Cambrian environments. Each may represent distinct settings that preserved soft-bodied animals in different ways. More debates arise around ecosystem structure. Were predators abundant, or were scavengers more common? Did these animals live in stable communities, or were they shifting with environmental change? Some researchers point to evidence of trilobite mass gatherings, possibly suggesting seasonal events or reproductive swarms. Others interpret mixed assemblages as storm deposits sweeping together animals from shallower and deeper areas. Without full context, the fossils give snapshots rather than continuous scenes. Imagine another deep time moment. A sudden slump of sediment cascades downslope, smothering a patch of seafloor. Animals are trapped beneath layers of fine mud. The water above remains calm, but below, oxygen rapidly drops. Microbial activity slows, decay stalls, minerals infuse tissues. Over millions of years, pressures mount and sediments harden. Fossils remain as guardians of a vanished world. But the details of the death event, its speed, its nature, its conditions, remain elusive. Some fossils show exquisite detail of eyes, limbs and gills, features extremely rare in normal sedimentary deposits. Others preserve outlines only. Paleontologists analyze them, compare them to Burgess Shale specimens, note similarities and differences, but understanding why Utah preserves some forms and not others remains part of the puzzle. Was water chemistry different? Did microbial mats play a stronger role? Did the sediments come from a different source? Each hypothesis overlaps with others. As you imagine these Cambrian seas, picture light filtering through shallow water, trilobites moving across the seafloor, soft creatures floating above, sediments drifting downward. Then imagine all of it gone. Ocean vanished, land uplifted, mountains rising, deserts forming. Yet inside these slabs, bodies remain. They hold detail too delicate to survive even a day in the modern ocean, preserved for 500 million years. And while we study them, name them, and reconstruct their world, much of that world slips through the gaps between what rock can tell and what time has erased. Stone spheres of an ancient sea, Moqui marbles, scattered across the pale Navajo sandstone of southern Utah, are dark, smooth spheres that look as if someone poured thousands of iron marbles across an old desert floor. Some are the size of peas, others the size of golf balls. A few grow in clusters, cemented together like beads on a string. Many rest loose on the surface, released from eroding sandstone. These are Moqui marbles. iron-rich concretions that puzzled explorers, geologists, and locals alike long before modern science began to unpack their story. Walk into the landscape as early morning light hits the sandstone. The rock glows orange. The marbles, darker and heavier, stand out with sharp contrast. They crunch lightly underfoot. Pick one up. It is surprisingly dense, hard, metallic in feel with an iron oxide shell surrounding a sandstone core. Break one open and the cross-section shows a thin outer skin of hematite or goethite. This shell is what protected the marble over millions of years. To understand how these marbles formed, imagine this region as it was during the Jurassic, a sea of shifting dunes, windblown sand stacking into cross-bedded layers. Over time, the dunes hardened into Navajo sandstone. Much later, groundwater began moving through these porous layers. This water carried dissolved iron. When chemical conditions changed, often due to microbial activity or shifts in oxygen levels, the iron precipitated out of solution, forming a solid shell around certain sand grains. Over long periods, these shells grew thicker, eventually creating the marbles now scattered across the desert. This is the broad model, but the specifics remain debated. Why did the iron concentrate in these spherical forms? Why did certain horizons within the sandstone produce dense clusters while others produced none? What triggered the chemical reactions at precise moments? These questions reflect how complex groundwater systems can be. Fluids do not move uniformly. They follow fractures, permeable layers, or pathways created by ancient structural shifts. Some zones receive more flow, others remain dry. The result is a landscape where iron concretions form in patterns not fully explained by current models. Now shift your view across planets. In the early 2000s, NASA's Opportunity rover landed on Mars. Rolling across the Meridiani Planum, its cameras spotted small dark spheres embedded in pale bedrock and scattered across the surface. They looked almost identical to Utah's marbles. The rover team named them blueberries. Chemical analysis revealed they were rich in hematite, just like the Moqui marbles. The similarity was striking. Two different worlds, yet the same shapes. Hard iron shells in sandstone-like deposits. This sparked a scientific bridge between Utah and Mars. If Moqui marbles formed due to groundwater altering ancient dunes, then the Martian spheres might point to a similar past. Water flowing through sediment, creating chemical gradients, leaving behind iron-rich concretions. But the Martian environment differs greatly from Utah. Lower gravity, colder temperatures, thinner atmosphere, and different chemistry all affect mineral formation. Scientists debate the exact processes that could create hematite spherules on Mars. Were they formed by groundwater like Utah's, or by volcanic processes, or by some other environmental factor? No single explanation satisfies all observations. Return to Utah. With the Martian comparison in mind, researchers study the marbles in more detail. Some marbles have concentric layers of iron, showing repeated episodes of precipitation. Others have irregular shapes stretched by groundwater movement. Some appear fused, suggesting periods of growth followed by erosion, then more growth. Mapping reveals that marbles cluster along ancient fluid pathways. These patterns help reconstruct how water once moved through the Navajo sandstone. But those pathways are not fully mapped, and their timing remains uncertain. One theory suggests that iron originally existed in the sandstone in dispersed form, coating grain surfaces or locked within minerals. When oxygen-poor groundwater moved through, microbes may have helped dissolve the iron. Later, when oxygen-rich fluids entered, the iron reprecipitated, forming hard shells. This process may have repeated for thousands of years, but microbes leave subtle fingerprints, and detecting them after millions of years requires careful analysis. Some researchers find evidence consistent with microbial mediation. Others argue the chemistry alone could produce the same results. The debate remains open. Another question centers on the age of the marbles. Some studies estimate they formed during the Cretaceous, while others suggest they are far younger, possibly as young as a few million years. The age depends on the timing of groundwater flow events, which are themselves tied to regional tectonic shifts, climate changes, and the uplift of the Colorado Plateau. If the plateau rose in stages, groundwater paths may have shifted repeatedly, creating multiple generations of marbles. Determining which generation each marble belongs to is difficult. Consider the layers of Navajo sandstone. Some contain thin iron bands, flat planar deposits rather than spheres. Others contain pipe-like iron features. The marbles anchor this spectrum of shapes, why spheres in one layer and sheets in another. The geometry of concretions reflects the balance between chemical reaction rates, fluid flow patterns, and sediment permeability. But the exact combination that produces so many near-perfect spheres in Utah is still not fully pinned down. Walk across a slope where the sandstone has eroded away. Marbles lie everywhere, freed from the rock. Wind piles them at the base of cliffs. Some gather in shallow depressions, forming natural collections. If you look closely at the sandstone walls, you see hollow cavities, negative moulds where marbles once sat. These holes show how many marbles were originally enclosed. Some surfaces were packed so densely it resembles a honeycomb of iron nodules. This density remains one of the enduring puzzles. Why did certain areas accumulate such huge numbers? Now imagine linking Utah and Mars again. Scientists compare the density, distribution, and internal composition of the marbles and the Martian blueberries. On Mars, the spheres often appear embedded in layered sandstones, thought to have formed in shallow water or playa environments. Some layers contain thousands per square meter. Utah shows similar densities in some places, but Mars lacks the same groundwater conditions we know from Earth. Could ancient Martian groundwater have once flowed more freely? Or did entirely different processes create similar spherical shapes? Scientists also compare the outer coatings. Moqui marbles have hematite shells, sometimes mixed with goethite. Martian spheres show strong hematite signatures, but the crystal structures differ subtly. These differences fuel debate. Did Mars's spheres form through slow chemical alteration, rapid precipitation, or a combination of multiple processes? Back on Earth, geologists test groundwater models through laboratory simulations. They watch iron precipitate under different chemical conditions. They see spheres begin to form, but the sizes and distributions rarely match Utah's exactly. This suggests additional factors, perhaps subtle structural controls or specific microbial communities, played a role in shaping the natural marbles. Standing among these spheres, you notice how quiet the landscape is. The iron shells feel ancient. The sandstone beneath your feet holds the memory of dunes that marched across this region nearly 200 million years ago. Groundwater arrived millions of years later, moving through cracks and layers, leaving behind these iron signatures. Each marble is a record of chemistry, fluid movement, and time distilled into a simple shape. But behind that shape lie unanswered questions. When exactly did the groundwater move through? How widespread were these fluid events? Why are the spheres so concentrated in certain horizons? And on Mars, was the process similar, or only visually so? Two worlds offer the same forms, but neither world gives a full explanation. Utah's marbles and Mars' blueberries mirror each other, raising the same core mystery. How does iron sculpt itself into spheres that survive for ages, long after the water that shaped them has vanished? A crater or a salt dome? The Upheaval dome? Debate. Stand at the rim of a circular canyon in the heart of Canyonlands National Park and the landscape drops away in sharp, dramatic tiers. Sandstone walls curl inward toward a chaotic center of fractured rock. Nothing about the shape looks natural at first glance. It's too round, too abrupt, too different from the long carved valleys and mesas surrounding it. This is Upheaval Dome, one of the most debated geologic features in the American Southwest. From above, the structure appears like a giant bullseye, a central uplift of broken rock surrounded by concentric rings of warped and tilted layers. Hike down one of the trails and you find yourself moving through rocks bent sharply upward, as if something pushed them from below. In some places, the layers tilt nearly vertical. In others, blocks are shattered into angular pieces. It feels as though the Earth's crust once suffered a violent event here, but what kind? For decades, geologists wrestled with two competing explanations. One view saw Upheaval Dome as the remnant of a rising salt dome, an ancient mass of buried salt that pushed upward through overlying rock layers. This idea fit well with the region's history because the Paradox Basin beneath Canyonlands contains thick sequences of salt deposits laid down during the Pennsylvanian period. These salt layers are known to flow and deform over millions of years, creating domes, anticlines, and faults. To early researchers, The uplifted centre and tilted rings of Upheaval Dome resembled features often formed by salt movement. But another group of geologists saw something different, the signature of a meteorite impact. The steep inward dips of the rock, the shattered central region, and the circular shape all mirrored patterns found in known impact structures around the world. Impact craters on Earth often show a central uplift, a rebound effect after the shockwave strikes. They also produce shock features in minerals, such as microscopic deformation in quartz grains. For a long time, both theories remained plausible. The region had plenty of salt, but the structure looked strikingly like an impact crater. Without strong physical evidence, textbooks listed the feature as a mystery, with some diagrams presenting one hypothesis, others presenting the opposite. Field geologists debated the structure in papers and at conferences, walking the same tilted layers and interpreting them in different ways. Now follow the trail deeper into the centre. You reach an overlook where the rock changes appearance. Blocks appear pulverised. Layers no longer form neat lines. It looks as if a sudden force broke, folded, and twisted them in a single moment. This is one of the clues that gradually shifted the debate. In 2008, a team studying samples from the dome identified shocked quartz, tiny grains of quartz with distinctive deformation patterns that form only under extreme pressure, such as the shock of a meteorite impact. These features do not appear in rocks deformed by slow geologic processes like salt flow. The discovery strongly favoured the impact hypothesis, and many textbooks have since updated their interpretation of Upheaval Dome as an impact structure. But even with this breakthrough, questions remain. The exact size of the meteorite that struck this region is not fully certain. The original crater shape has been eroded over tens of millions of years, leaving only the deeply carved remnant. Estimates suggest the crater may have been 3 to 6 kilometers wide originally, but erosion has removed much of the outer rim, making reconstruction difficult. The age of the impact also remains debated. Some studies propose it occurred during the Jurassic, others point to younger ages. The lack of preserved ejecta, material blasted outward by the impact, complicates age estimates. Think back to the salt dome hypothesis. While the discovery of shocked quartz weakened that theory, some features of the dome still resemble salt structures. The region's geology is complex. Salt layers beneath canyonlands have influenced regional deformation for hundreds of millions of years. It is possible that salt movement shaped the area both before and after the impact occurred, altering the crater in ways that blur its original form. This overlap makes the structure difficult to interpret in full. Walk the rim once more. From here, the circular form looks clear. The layers dip inward, as if they collapsed following a sudden blow. The central peak rises steeply, jagged and irregular. Impact craters often show this peak ring structure, but in Upheaval Dome, erosion has carved deeply into the rocks, stripping away much of the crater floor and walls. What remains is the resistant core and some distorted rings. Scientists create models to simulate the impact. They imagine a meteorite striking thick sandstone overlying salt deposits. Shock waves radiate outward. Rock at the centre rebounds upward, forming the uplift. Salt layers below may flow in response, warping the shape even further. Over millions of years, water, wind and freeze-thaw weathering carve out the dome, leaving behind the formation seen today. Researchers also compare Upheaval Dome with other impact structures, like Barringer Crater in Arizona or more eroded craters in Canada and Scandinavia. Some features match well, others reflect the unique geology of canyonlands. The combination of sandstone, salt and deep erosion produces a hybrid landscape not easily classified. While impact evidence is strong, the details of how the shockwave interacted with the underlying salt remain unclear. From another vantage point, you see colourful banding in the rock, greenish, reddish, and white layers marking changes in ancient environments. Impact events can disturb these layers dramatically, but so can salt movement. Distinguishing between the two requires microscopic work. Researchers examine thin slices of rock under specialised lenses. They look for planar deformation features, microscopic lines etched into quartz by shock pressures. Their presence confirms impact. Their distribution helps map the energy of the collision. Yet even here, the story is incomplete. How far did the shockwave travel? Why are some areas thick with deformation while others seem unaffected? Did the meteorite strike at an angle or straight down? Models provide possibilities but no single answer. Now trace your steps back along the rim. The desert opens before you. Wide canyons, mesas, and distant cliffs. Upheaval Dome sits like a wound in the landscape. Its origin, now leaning strongly toward impact, still invites questions. Its age is uncertain. Its precise shape at the moment of impact is unknown. Its relationship to the salt-rich geology beneath it remains partly unresolved. Two theories, salt dome and impact crater, once stood in equal contest. Today, the impact theory dominates. But the dome still carries the fingerprints of both ideas. The violent shattering of rock consistent with a meteorite, and the subtle warping linked to salt flow. Even now, geologists revisit the site, gather more samples, refine their models, and walk the same tilted layers seeking clearer answers. As you leave the rim, the structure remains behind you, round, fractured, defiant. One of Utah's great geological riddles, narrowed but not fully solved. Ghost shorelines of an inland sea, Lake Bonavville. Stand on a ridge above the Great Salt Lake and let your eyes follow the smooth horizontal lines carved into the mountainsides around you. They look like roads cut into the rock, or benches built by some ancient engineer. But they are older than any human presence in this basin. These terraces are the ghost shorelines of Lake Bonavville, a massive Ice Age lake that once covered nearly half of what is now Utah, stretching into Nevada and Idaho, filling valleys that today hold salt flats, farms and towns. Imagine the landscape not as desert but as an inland sea. Water spreads far beyond the modern shoreline, covering 200 times the area of the current lake. Waves break against high cliffs. Beaches form where there are now foothills. Islands poke through the water where cities now stand. During the late Pleistocene, as glaciers advanced and retreated across North America, climate shifts created the conditions for Bonaville's rise: cooler temperatures, higher precipitation, and reduced evaporation. Rivers and springs fed the basin faster than water could escape, and because the Great Basin has no natural outlet to the ocean, the water accumulated until it reached astonishing levels. Now picture the lake at its peak around 18,000 years ago. The waterline stands at the Provo shoreline, one of the most clearly preserved terraces. Hills around the basin are cut into horizontal steps, each one a mark left by a stable lake level that lasted for centuries or millennia. These lines reveal the story of Bonaville's fluctuations, but they are only clues. They do not explain precisely how fast the lake rose, or how climate cycles translated into its dramatic expansions and contractions. Walk along one of these terraces. The ground under your feet is surprisingly flat. It was once a beach, waves polished gravel here. Ice Age winds carried silt across the surface. Small deltas formed at river mouths. Every contour tells of a shoreline that shifted with climate rhythms. Warming, cooling, drying, and wetting phases that altered the balance between inflow and evaporation. Scientists reconstruct these patterns using sediments, isotopes, and radiocarbon dating. But the exact timing of each rise and fall remains an ongoing puzzle, refined with every new core sample. At the lake's highest point, water spilled northward out of the basin at a narrow gap in Idaho, known as Red Rock Pass. The overflow triggered the Bonavville Flood, one of the largest floods in North American history. Imagine water surging out of the basin, carving channels, moving boulders the size of cars, scouring new valleys. The flow rate was immense, rivaling the Missoula floods of the Pacific Northwest. This event lowered Lake Bonavville by more than 100 meters in a geological instant. Yet the precise sequence of events, the rate of water release, the exact topographic changes at the outlet, still contains uncertainties. Erosion erased some evidence. Sediment from later Lake Bonavville stages covers other clues. After the flood, the lake stabilized at the Provo level for some time. Then climate began shifting again. As Ice Age conditions waned, temperatures rose, evaporation increased, inflows decreased. The lake shrank step by step. By about 14,000 years ago, the water surface had retreated dramatically. Each retreat left behind new shorelines, lower and lower. These descending terraces marked the lake's collapse as the basin dried. Eventually, only remnants remained, the largest of which is today's Great Salt Lake. From this ridge, you can almost visualize the deep time flyover, the modern lake below you, small and hypersaline, then the basin filling with water, rising up the mountain slopes, then overflowing at Red Rock Pass, unleashing the flood, then gradually shrinking again as climate warmed. Overlaying each stage are the ghost shorelines, dozens of them, etched at different altitudes. Scientists map these terraces across the landscape, matching their elevations to reconstruct the lake's geometry. But linking each shoreline to an exact date requires interpreting sediment layers that do not always preserve clean boundaries. Isostatic rebound adds another layer of complexity. Water is heavy. During Bonavville's peak, the enormous weight of the lake pressed down on the Earth's crust, causing the centre of the basin to sink slightly while the surrounding margins rose. After the lake drained, the crust rebounded slowly over thousands of years. This rebound warps shoreline elevations today. Terraces that were once perfectly level now tilt slightly. Correcting for this tilt allows geologists to estimate original lake levels, but the amount of rebound varies across the basin, making the corrections an evolving task. Move mentally across the basin. In the west, near Bonavville salt flats, the shoreline terraces are broad and striking. In the east, near the Wasatch Front, they climb quickly up steep slopes. The difference reflects topography, rebound, and erosion. Some areas preserve terraces cleanly, others eroded away or were buried under later deposits. Piecing these fragments together resembles solving a giant incomplete puzzle, one that spans thousands of square miles and tens of thousands of years. Now picture the climate transitions that shaped Bonavville. During glacial times, jet streams shifted southward, bringing more moisture to the Great Basin. Snowpack increased, melting into rivers each spring. Cooler temperatures slowed evaporation. The lake rose. During interglacial periods like today, storm tracks migrated north, and the basin dried. Scientists analyze pollen grains, lake sediments, and glacial moraines to link Bonaville's expansions to larger climate systems. But not all shoreline changes correlate neatly with global climate records. Some lake level shifts appear too rapid or too localized to be explained by broad patterns alone. This raises questions about smaller scale climate dynamics, storm frequency, regional drought cycles, and groundwater contributions. From your vantage point on the ridge, you watch the modern Great Salt Lake shimmer in the distance. Its surface fluctuates year by year, responding to snowfall, drought, and river diversions. But compared to Bonavville, it is tiny, a remnant, a memory. Its shrinking outlines echo the basin's deeper rhythms. The ghost shorelines around you, some faint, some bold, serve as markers of a landscape in constant transformation. They show a lake that grew to the size of Lake Michigan, spilled in a catastrophic flood, then collapsed into pieces. They reveal climate shifts recorded in stone. But they also leave gaps. The exact timing of each major level, the nuances of isostatic rebound, the details of ancient weather patterns. You follow one terrace toward a cliff. The line continues until it vanishes behind a fold in the rock. Another terrace appears higher above, another lies below. Together they form a staircase into the past. Steps carved not by hands but by water, climate and time. Each step a clue. Each step an unanswered question about a lake that shaped the land long before the desert took its place. One tree, 47,000 trunks. The enigma of Pando. Walk into Fish Lake National Forest and the first impression is of an ordinary grove. Tall, pale trunks rising close together, leaves trembling in the light wind. But as you move among the trees, something feels different. The trunks stand at similar heights, their leaves shift in unison, their bark shows repeating patterns. Then you learn the truth. You're not walking through a forest of many trees. You're standing inside one organism, one living being spread across more than 100 acres. One root system supporting around 47,000 stems. This is Pando, the trembling giant. Imagine following one trunk down into the earth. The roots do not stop. They connect to another, and another, and another. Each stem above ground is not an independent tree but a sprout, an expression of a single genetic individual. If one stem dies, another shoots up elsewhere. If a fire sweeps through, the organism can resprout from deep underground. Pando survives not by growing upward, but outward, across centuries. Step by step, it expands as a slow-moving wave of leaves. Now picture Pando as a character, an organism with thousands of limbs and a single underground body. To attempt to understand its age is to ask how long this being has been stretching itself across the landscape. Some stems are only a few decades old, others are older, hollowing from within. But the root system is the true organism. the part that has survived countless cycles of stem death and regrowth. Scientists have tried to estimate its age through genetic studies, growth rates, soil layers, and climate reconstructions. Early popular claims placed its origins tens of thousands of years in the past, even up to 80,000 years or more. These high numbers appeared in articles, signs, and even documentaries, but they were not based on strong data. More recent research suggests a more grounded range. Studies that consider the rate at which aspen clones spread estimate that Pando's root system could be around 14,000 to 16,000 years old. That would place its origin near the end of the last ice age, when glaciers were retreating and new ecosystems were forming across the Great Basin. Yet even this estimate has uncertainty. Growth rates vary depending on soil depth, water availability, competition from other plants, and disturbance events like fire. A clone under ideal conditions can spread faster than one in marginal conditions. Without a clear record of past environments, applying modern rates backward in time remains guesswork. Think of what Pando has lived through if it is indeed that old. During its earliest years, the climate of Utah was wetter and cooler. Grasslands and spruce fir forests filled valleys that today hold sagebrush and juniper. Large mammals, mammoths, camels, giant bison, wandered through this region. Even then, Pando's root system may have sent up its first stems. Over millennia, as climates shifted and the landscape dried, Pando persisted. Its stems died and regrew countless times. Fires burned sections, drought slowed growth, bark beetles came and went. Yet the organism remained beneath the soil, waiting for favourable conditions to sprout again. Walk among the stems and imagine this slow persistence. Each trunk is short-lived compared to the whole, a brief episode in the organism's long story. A stem may rise, reach maturity, and fall within a century, yet the root system beneath it continues, sending up new shoots, reconfiguring itself, covering ground that its earlier stems once shaded. The forest is not static but dynamic, shifting patches of stems within one enduring being. Pando grows and shrinks in pulses, like breaths taken centuries apart. Scientists debate how stable that root system really is. Some studies suggest that parts of Pando are no longer regenerating as they once did. Browsing deer and elk eat young shoots before they can grow into stems. Human activities, roads, cabins, fire suppression alter natural cycles. In some areas, the clone appears stagnant, aging without producing new growth. This raises questions. Is Pando still expanding, or has it reached a limit? If growth slowed in the present, does that affect models of how fast it could have spread in the past? There is also debate about how Pando came to dominate this patch of forest. Did it expand rapidly during a brief window of ideal climate conditions? Did it gradually replace earlier vegetation over thousands of years? Or did fire create an opening that allowed the clone to establish and spread? Without a direct fossil or sedimentary record tied specifically to this root system, researchers must infer its history from patterns in the landscape and lessons from other aspen clones. Move to the edge of the grove. Here, Pando transitions to stands of other aspens, true, separate individuals. These neighbouring trees grow from seeds, unlike the clonal stems. In rare years, when conditions align, heavy spring moisture, late freezes avoided, the right temperatures, aspens produce viable seeds that can establish. But clonal reproduction is far more common. This raises another question. Was Pando originally a seedling that happened to take root in a prime location, expanding from that single origin point through time? Or did multiple seedlings once fill the area, leaving Pando as the survivor while others died out? Genetic tests show Pando is indeed one individual, but they do not reveal the fate of its neighbours from long ago. As you continue walking, notice the uniform shaking of leaves. When wind sweeps through the grove, tens of thousands of leaves quake together, giving the name quaking aspen. In Pando, this trembling becomes something more remarkable, a single organism responding to one stimulus with thousands of moving parts. If Pando is 14,000 years old, every stem you see is the newest chapter of an ancient genetic script. Yet that age is still a matter of debate. Some researchers caution that we cannot easily extrapolate the clone's spread rate without knowing past growth conditions. If earlier climates were wetter, the clone might have expanded faster. If droughts dominated, growth might have slowed for centuries. Some even propose that the clone could be younger than current estimates, perhaps only a few thousand years old. Without direct sampling of ancient roots or preserved DNA in soils, the age range remains wide. Others argue the opposite, that Pando could be older than current estimates, especially if it expanded slowly or endured long periods of little growth. But supporting evidence is sparse. Some climate models suggest that the region's environmental shifts could allow a clone to persist for longer than expected. But without precise dating of soil horizons linked directly to the organism's early stages, the high-end age claims remain speculative. The scientists studying Pando approach it from different angles: dendrochronology, genetics, soil chemistry, ecological modelling. Each method offers part of the picture, none a complete answer. Meanwhile, Pando continues its slow life underground. Shoots rise, stems fall. The organism changes shape without ever changing identity. Walk out of the grove and turn back for one last look. What appears to be a forest is in fact one being. Its age lies somewhere between the late Ice Age and the present. Ancient but not timeless. Old but not fully measured. It moves slowly across the land, trunk by trunk, a living puzzle whose true beginning remains hidden beneath layers of earth and time. The village that walked away, Red Cliff's archaeological site, stand on the edge of a quiet neighbourhood near St. George, and the first thing you notice is how ordinary everything looks. Houses, driveways, trimmed shrubs, the hum of distant traffic. But a short walk beyond the pavement brings you into a different world. Thorny brush gives way to open desert. Red cliffs rise in front of you, and at your feet, scattered across sandy soil, lie small shards of pottery, faded, broken, half buried. They are the surviving traces of a village that once lived here, farmed here, raised children here, and then, sometime in the 1100s or 1200s CE, walked away. The Red Cliffs archaeological site is easy to miss if you don't know where to look. Low mounds mark where rooms once stood. Stone outlines hint at walls long collapsed. Storage pits lie just beneath the surface, filled long ago with corn cobs, seeds, charcoal, and fragments of everyday life. What remains is subtle, nothing like the massive cliff dwellings farther east. And yet, this quiet site captures something essential about the final centuries of the ancestral Puebloan world in southwestern Utah. Imagine the village as it once was, a small cluster of households built partly of masonry and partly of wood and mud, rooms arranged around shared courtyards, grinding stones set into the ground for processing maize, outdoor hearths, storage structures elevated or buried to keep food safe, irrigation channels leading from nearby washes, guiding water towards small fields of corn, beans and squash. Families worked these patches every season, managing scarce water with careful timing and constant attention. This settlement was not isolated. It belonged to the westernmost edge of the ancestral Puebloan cultural world, connected through trade, intermarriage, shared styles of pottery, and regional movements of people. Though smaller than villages farther east, Red Cliffs played its part in a landscape of farming communities that stretched across what are now Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. Walk through the site with the late morning sun overhead. You see the faint outline of a room block. The stones are small, locally sourced from the surrounding cliffs. This was not a fortress or ceremonial centre. It was a home, practical, modest, functional. Archaeologists identify living rooms by the presence of hearths, ash lenses and small artefacts, stone tools, pottery sherds, grinding stones. Storage rooms appear as compact spaces with fewer domestic remains. Everything suggests a community focused on farming and household life, rather than large-scale architecture. As you step between the low mounds, imagine the sounds of the village. Children running between rooms, dogs barking, stone tools tapping against corn kernels, wind rustling through brush, the smell of roasting seeds in outdoor hearths. Life here was adapted to desert constraints. Just enough water, just enough soil, just enough stability to sustain a few generations. But the desert holds its limits, and those limits began to tighten. By the late 1100s and early 1200s, the region experienced prolonged drought. Tree ring data from across the southwest shows a sequence of dry years and reduced stream flow. Fields that once yielded food began to fail. Water became less predictable. Wildlife patterns shifted. In many parts of the Four Corners region, larger villages were already thinning out. People moved toward areas with more reliable water or joined communities farther south. What happened at Red Cliffs fits this broad pattern. but no one can say exactly how the decision unfolded. Archaeology shows abandonment, rooms left behind, storage pits no longer filled, charcoal layers that simply stop. But it cannot show the conversation that happened in each household. It cannot show the moment when a family realised the harvest was too small again, or when elders decided it was time to join relatives elsewhere. It cannot show the worry, the weighing of options, the final quiet acts of packing and leaving. Scientists analyse pollen grains preserved in storage pits. They find corn, amaranth, native grasses. They examine animal bones, mostly small game, consistent with local hunting patterns. They look at pottery styles. Some sherds match traditions farther east, suggesting trade or cultural influence. But none of these findings explain the departure in personal terms. Archaeology offers clues, not motives. Now picture the abandonment as a gradual shift. Perhaps one household left first, seeking water elsewhere. Another followed after a failed harvest. Over time, the village emptied, rooms collapsed, winds carried sand into courtyards, brush grew over wall lines. The soundscape faded until only desert remained. Walk along one of the small washes near the site. The land slopes gently, offering a place where farmers once diverted seasonal runoff. Channels carved into soil still appear faintly in certain lights, straight lines out of place in natural erosion. These irrigation traces show effort and planning, signs of a community that worked hard to make the most of what water they had. But even ingenuity has limits in a drying climate. Farther upslope you find a scatter of pottery that differs slightly in thickness and paint from other shards at the site. Variations in pottery connect red cliffs to regional shifts in style. They show interaction, trade and cultural exchange, but they also show time passing. Some styles associated with the 1100s disappear after the village's abandonment, reinforcing the timeline of departure. Still, the exact year, or decade, remains open to interpretation. The desert around the site stretches outward toward the Pine Valley Mountains. Today, suburban development approaches the edges of this historical footprint. Yet beneath the ground, the faint record of the village persists, storage pits filled with windblown sand, post holes preserved as dark circles in soil, fire-cracked rock marking cooking areas. The people who lived here left no written records and no monumental structures, but their daily rhythms remain traceable through the quiet residue of life. Archaeologists reconstruct these rhythms with care, but acknowledge the limits. They can say which crops were grown, how rooms were arranged, how tools were made. They can date the final occupation window, but they cannot know the moment when the last family stood at the edge of the village, looked back at the homes they built and then turned toward a new horizon. From where you stand, modern homes sit just beyond the archaeological boundary. Cars pass occasionally. The contrast is stark, a living community beside the faint remains of one that vanished centuries ago. Yet the land remembers both. The red cliffs rise unchanged, the sun follows its same arc, and beneath the soil lie the outlines of decisions made in a world without writing, preserved only in the form of rooms left empty. The village did not fall in a dramatic collapse, it simply ended, quietly, subtly, the record tapering off until nothing remained but silence. And that silence, shaped by drought and choice and uncertainty, is the final voice of Red Cliffs. A reminder that even when we uncover every stone, the most human part of the story, the reason families walked away, remains out of reach. These places are real, and the evidence behind them is solid. Yet even after decades of research, questions remain. Some stories are missing pieces, others are only partly understood. Utah keeps its secrets in cliffs, deserts, and rock layers that hold more history than we can uncover at once. What we know is only the beginning, and much of what happened here is still waiting in the ground, the stone, and the silence.